Hey there, friends. Before we get into the stories today, I just wanted to say that this is a sleep collection, and as such, you may have heard some of these stories before. These stories all premiered the second half of November of 2025, so if you've been around since then, there's a good chance. That's all. Just wanted to say that really quick. And with that, enjoy and sleep well. Hello, new submitter here, but I had something happen to me last year that I wanted to share. I'm a 28-year-old woman, 27 at the time of this story, and live in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. My apartment complex wasn't really in a dangerous neighborhood per se, but not exactly the safest either. I say not the safest because we have had reports of break-ins, both homes and cars, but nothing violent. We just all knew not to leave anything unlocked or show off any valuables. My apartment complex specifically, though, had not had any break-ins, so I wasn't really worried about it happening. But I did still keep everything locked. You can't be too careful. I do live alone, beside my little 4-year-old border collie mix named Polly. My nephew named him. He was still young and full of energy, so we went for walks daily, or rather nightly. Because of my work schedule, our walks almost always happened late at night. I know it probably wasn't the smartest choice, but, like I said, the worst crimes were break-ins, not personal robberies. I'd also been walking at night for a few years without any real problems, so I didn't feel unsafe. This night was no different, and we went for our normal walk around 10 p.m. I'm a creature of habit, so we always took the same route. I went down my street, left at the end, through a small dog park with a friendly trail, and then a big loop through the residential streets before heading home. The whole thing took about 45 minutes, and it was a peaceful walk. There were very few people around at that time. Maybe someone here or there walking, or standing outside of a building smoking, but that was about it. Usually I'll put my earbuds in and just decompress from whatever stress work has thrown at me. At one point in my walks, I started noticing this car on our route. I'm not great with car models, but it was a beat-up sedan. Maybe late 90s or early 2000s, in a dark blue or black color. I passed by from the back, and could see a large dent in the rear bumper and a spiderweb crack on the passenger side of the windshield. At first it seemed like a normal car. It was parked on the side of the street in front of a home, and I had no reason to think anything further about it, other than being someone's car that lived nearby or was visiting someone that did. I really only made note of it because I walked on that side of the street. And since there was no sidewalk there, I had to walk along the side of the street. And with that car there, I had to walk around it. I kept seeing this car as we continued our walks, but it was in a similar place on that same street. I thought it was a little curious that all the houses along that street had driveways and they were never full, so I wondered why they weren't in the driveway. But then, I also noticed that it wasn't in the same place. It was parked in random places on that same road, which was weird to me. I remember one time I tried to look to see if anyone was in it as I passed by, but the windows must have been tinted because I couldn't see inside. It was also just as I walked by, so I didn't stop to look or press my face against the car, meaning I didn't try very hard, so I couldn't tell. But then, there was one night that I walked past it, and once I was in front of it, the headlights kicked on. I couldn't hear the motor, so it was pretty clearly off, but the lights were definitely there. As it got brighter in front of me, casting my shadow straight ahead, I turned around to see if someone may have been walking to the car, but no one ever did. There was no one around, and after a few seconds, the lights turned back off. Again, weird, and it startled me, if I'm being honest, but nothing else happened and we continued our walk. It was about 2 weeks later when this event actually happened. Clearly, this car had been there for a while with nothing happening, so I had no reason to change my routine. Again, we went for our walk, and after a specifically rough day, I just wanted to zone out and listen to the crickets chirp, so I left my earbuds at home. The walk started out normal. We made our usual loop through the park. Polly seemed to be more anxious after a while, stopping to look around for every little sound, which unfortunately did make me more irritable. Then we turned on that street and I saw the car in the usual spot. And for some reason, this time I was hesitant. I got that sense of being watched, and it just felt different. I had no idea why. I wrapped Polly's leash around my wrist a second time to bring him in closer, and kept my hand in my jacket pocket, holding my phone. But this time, as we walked by the car, I could actually see movement inside. It was just a shadow, but I could see the shape of a person moving in the driver's seat. I looked forward again and continued to walk straight ahead, just wanting to get off that road and get back home. That's when the headlights kicked in again, but it was followed by the sound of the engine turning over. My heart immediately started racing, and again, I don't know why. So, someone was in the car, but it's not like they had done anything wrong. But something was telling me that I needed to get out of there. It didn't help seeing how tense Polly was acting either. I've always been told that animals pick up on danger faster and quicker than humans, and it reminded me how the walk started with him on edge, validating my fears at that moment. I picked up my pace, and Polly stayed right at my heels. Then, I heard the car start rolling. I glanced back and saw it moving straight ahead, slowly. I told myself that they were just leaving and that they would pass by soon, but they never did. I could still hear the tires on the road, but they never passed. I looked back once more and saw that it was now closer, but still hadn't sped up. I started to panic a bit more. Were they purposefully following me? I started running through my options. The street that I was on was all residential, so no businesses, and certainly not any open at that hour. And no people were around, and there were barely any streetlights. If something were to happen, would anyone even respond to me screaming for help or banging on their door? Would I have enough time to call 911? I thought about my route ahead. If I continued straight, I would eventually hit the next street, which had better lighting and a better chance of traffic, but that was still 4 or 5 blocks away. As I was looking around and weighing my options, the car finally sped up and was now rolling along beside me. I looked over and both driver's side windows rolled down. From a quick glance, I could see 3 guys in the car. The one in the back seat asked me if I wanted a ride, and they all started laughing, putting me even more on edge. They started to say something else, something about me not responding to them, but I was ignoring them, trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. That is when I remembered there was a shortcut. About a block ahead, there was an intersection with another street, but the other one was a dead end for cars. There was a pedestrian path at the end to cut through to the other street, which was always busy. It was well lit, and it had a bar and grill that was open late. I didn't waste any time. I started walking faster, noticing the car picked up its speed too. I started turning like I was going to cross in front of the car, and then zipped around and took off running to the left. I still had a hold of Polly's leash, and bless him, but he kept up perfectly, with his leash barely even going taut. I could hear them shouting at me from the car, and the car accelerating. I didn't look back and just focused on the end of the street. I was a pretty average size, I wasn't exactly skinny, and I went on these nightly walks, but I rarely ran like I did that night. My lungs were burning. I stopped when I reached the small pedestrian path, scooped Polly up in my arms, and carried him through the narrow, barely 4 feet wide path. I heard the car stop, and they continued to shout things at me that I don't care to repeat here. I was worried that they would try to follow me on foot, but surprisingly, they didn't. I popped through to the other side, walked down to the bar, and stood close to 2 older ladies and a man. I didn't want to bother them, but I also didn't want to look alone. They didn't really seem to pay much attention to me either, until they heard Polly whimpering. I pulled out my phone and called 911 because it still needed to be reported that those guys were clearly following me. I only kicked myself a few times for never thinking about looking at or memorizing a license plate. I told them what happened, and they said they would send someone to the bar that I was at to talk with me further. They apparently already had an officer in the area, because they pulled up before I even got off the phone with them. I told her what happened, and she said that someone else was over on the other side patrolling to see if they could spot the car. And they never did. She did give me a ride home, though, which also relieved a lot of stress. I was pretty worried about having to walk home after all that. Once back home, she explained that she would contact me personally if they had any updates, and also told me to not hesitate on calling them if I saw this car again. Thankfully, I never did. I didn't walk that path for the longest time, fearing that I might run into them a second time, but I took it during the day with my now boyfriend and the car was not there. I'm still curious if they were there for someone, or really why they were there in the first place. All I know is that was the worst thing that has ever happened to me since I've been living there. And if that's the only thing that ever does happen, that would be fine by me. Back when I was a kid, my Uncle Brett started seeing this woman named Dana. I never really cared for her, and I don't think many people in my family did either. From the beginning, she rubbed everyone the wrong way. She had this condescending way of talking about our family traditions. She always commented about how some of the things that we did were outdated, and suggested improvements or mentioning how things were done, quote, the right way. Not to mention, she also had a very bad habit of trying to one-up everyone. Especially me, who, at the time, was 12 years old. What kind of full-grown adult is threatened by a child? And that is exactly how I got this story. It literally started over cookies. Back when I was 10, I had invented these peanut butter and banana cookies inspired by the sandwiches that Uncle Brett and I used to make together when I stayed over at his house. I know I probably didn't actually invent the idea, but my mom and I spent time experimenting in the kitchen until I got them right. My uncle had cancer that had caused him to no longer be able to have kids, and it crushed him. I may not have been able to fully understand it as a kid, but I could tell that he was upset and not quite the same after his surgery. So, I wanted to make those cookies for him, and I made them just as I wanted. I used real mashed bananas in the dough, and after baking, they were still soft and chewy. And he loved them. They became my signature dessert at family gatherings, and Uncle Brett would dramatically hoard them, pretending to guard the container from everyone else. It was just our thing. Then, Dana was invited to our family get-togethers, as she was with our favorite uncle. We could tolerate her for a few hours so that we could spend some time with him, but when I brought out the cookies, she would get so angry. At one point, Uncle Brett joked with her that he would marry her on the spot if she could figure out my secret recipe, and while we all laughed, she looked pissed. I remember her even making a comment about how they were made by a child, so it was probably just loaded with sugar and preservatives. I didn't even really know what that meant, but before any of us could respond, my uncle would jump in and calm her down and say that he was just joking. But the way that she acted toward my family, that had always been close, it irritated me. So I always made sure to personally hand him the container of take-home cookies, just for him. But even without my recipe, they got married in 2005, and only a few select people were allowed to be at the wedding. I was not one of them. Unsurprising, but her sister's kids were all over. Anyways, after the wedding, Dana became more competitive for his attention and approval, and we saw him even less. He still came to major holidays, but he did miss some of the smaller ones, including birthdays, which was disappointing, but it is what it is. That was until Thanksgiving of 2007. I was 16 at this point, now old enough to help out more in the kitchen without supervision. So when Uncle Brett and Dana showed up, I looked over to greet them, saw Dana carrying one of those aluminum foil containers, and told her that she could put it on the card table in the dining room with the rest of the food. I didn't ask her what she brought, or even talk about it because I was busy helping my mom. I also didn't pay much attention that she wasn't standing with my uncle, as my mom and I talked to him. I assumed that she was looking over and judging what food was there, as she liked to do. After dinner, we were all scattered around and someone mentioned desserts. Dana went to the table that we had set up with them and brought her container back to the dining room. As she took the foil off the top, she confidently said that she had tried her hand at making the peanut butter banana cookies, too. She had this smug look on her face when she said it as well. I knew that mine were great. Even if she had figured out a way to make hers better, I knew that mine were the original and that my uncle and I would always cherish that. Even so, I was excited to try hers, to see what she had come up with without knowing my full recipe. I pulled one out with the rest of the group and noticed that they looked identical to mine. Then I tried it. It tasted fantastic, and also exactly like mine. I was honestly curious if she had come up with it herself or if my mom may had shared my recipe. My uncle was impressed, telling her that she nailed it. But something was off to me. This whole thing was weird. I went and grabbed my container of cookies and immediately noticed that they weren't as cakey. However, when I pulled them out of the oven, they were. So how could they have deflated so much since cooling off? That hadn't happened to me since my first batch. I placed them on the table and ate one anyway to compare. Those were not my cookies. They were dry and crumbly, with a slight crunch, which aren't necessarily bad things in cookies, but that is not how I made mine. After eating both, I had this crazy idea in my head and kept it to myself. What if she swapped our cookies to make hers look better? I was a kid, accusing an adult of this, and at the time, even being 16, it seemed outrageous to me. So, with my suspicions, I asked her how she got them so soft, and she scoffed at me like it was a silly question. She said that she just experimented with the amount of oil that she used. I then asked her how much banana extract she used, and she said that she couldn't remember because she would pour some in to taste it. Then, my uncle joked with her, asking what her technique was, and again she chuckled a bit, delaying by taking a drink. And when we were all watching her, she said that she wasn't going to tell us, because she didn't want me to steal her recipe. But here's the thing. I didn't use banana extract. I used real mashed up bananas with the right kind of peanut butter. That way you don't need extra oil because of all the oil in that. That, combined with some of the other things that I add, with my mom's suggestion, is how I made them so soft and fluffy. She was wrong because she undoubtedly swapped them and didn't have a clue on how to do it. I was angry. I was planning on telling my mom about it after they left, not wanting to cause a scene, and probably give her the reaction that she had wanted, so I waited. I started walking over to the dessert table to find something else to eat. I didn't even want to eat my real cookies to give her an ounce of satisfaction. As I started cutting into a pie, I heard my cousin on the couch behind me cough. I looked back because it was a pretty hard cough, but then he smiled and said that he was fine. No big deal. But his mom then walked in there too, a different aunt, and mentioned that his lips looked swollen. He was 3 years younger than me, so he was still a kid, but he was able to talk and explain what he was feeling. He said that he choked on the cookie but was fine and then asked for water. My aunt went to grab a cup, and he started clearing his throat more and touching his throat and chest. That's when it started to sound like he was gasping. I went over to him thinking maybe he was choking and was going to pat him on the back, but then I noticed his lips swelling even more. And the hives started. I yelled for my aunt and uncle, who ran back to the room, and my aunt yelled about him having an allergic reaction. My aunt asked him what all he ate, and he had pointed to the second cookie on the coffee table. Of course, he was allergic to walnuts. To my horror, I realized it was one of the cookies in my container, the ones that Dana had swapped. I went to the dining room, and I asked her if she put walnuts in her cookies. And again, as if there wasn't a sense of urgency, she scoffed and said, "Of course she did." I didn't hide my anger anymore. I told her that she had swapped out the cookies because I did not add walnuts to mine, because I knew that my cousin was allergic and I knew that he loved them too. A few people looked at her and she still denied it. She said that I was being childish because hers were better, and that I clearly needed to pay more attention to people's allergies. It didn't make sense. She admitted to putting walnuts in hers, but I didn't. Yet he ate what he thought was one of mine, because he knew they would be safe. My aunt was on the phone with 911, digging through her purse for an EpiPen. My cousin was now on the floor wheezing, and still Dana blamed me. My Uncle Brett just stood there staring at Dana with this horrified realization. The paramedics arrived and rushed my cousin and aunt to the hospital, my uncle following behind in his car. They did spend the rest of the night in the hospital, but thankfully he was okay. Dana never admitted to what she had done. After the ambulance left, she acted like she was the victim in the entire thing. She said to my Uncle Brett something about wanting to leave because some people were disrespectful. My uncle gave us all hugs and well wishes and then asked us to keep him updated, and they left. My parents both told me that night that they knew something was up with the cookie thing. They hadn't tried the real ones that she brought, but said that when they tried her container of them, they were clearly mine, or an exact replica of them. My mom even said that she would never have shared my recipe unless I wanted her to. She not only almost killed my cousin, but she also wouldn't let my uncle go to most family events after that. He came over for Christmas and would stop by for Thanksgiving, but he never stayed for dinner. He just came in to talk, and would take a whole container of cookies home with him. Anything else, like birthday parties, there was always a reason that he couldn't come. We all knew that it was Dana. But, thankfully, that didn't last much longer. They were divorced 2 years later. Then, with me being a young adult, he started coming to more parties and events, and he would actually talk about the problems between him and Dana. He mentioned some pretty manipulative tactics that she would pull on him, and little did she realize that she forced them into counseling, and that same counseling made him realize his worth, and that they really weren't compatible. He filed for divorce, which was the most control and decision he had made for himself in quite a long time. We were all just happy to have him back around. He always has been the life of the party, and we were back to being a happy and goofy family. I was back to making my cookies for everyone, and not having anyone almost die from eating the wrong thing because someone was jealous. So, to Dana, I truly hope that we never meet again. That goes for my entire family. My friend Isaac and I loved to explore run-down, abandoned, and forgotten places. Most of the time, we're talking buildings, but sometimes that also included open acres where buildings once stood, and were now taken back over by nature. Those are some of my favorites. But there's one building that I'll never forget about. It was an old hospital that had been closed for decades. It was shut down by authorities once everyone started realizing some of the unethical experiments and tests that they ran on patients. Welcome to the American medical system. And there were talks about it being sold to someone who wanted to reopen it as some kind of spooky bed and breakfast. It certainly wasn't even close to getting to that point, but even so, we wanted to check it out before that happened. Lots of people liked to make comments about it being haunted, and for good reason. So, we made some plans to check it out one evening, just the two of us. We parked at a store on the back side of the building, and hiked through the woods to avoid anyone seeing our car at the hospital. It did have a few no trespassing signs along the fence, so yes, what we did was not legal, and I would not recommend it. Something about doing as I say, or whatever. Just approaching the building was pretty eerie. Multiple windows were broken and covered by boards or plastic. The lawn was not being cared for either, so it was overgrown with vines crawling over the outside and nearby trees. We agreed that our best way would be through one of the boarded windows, and that way we could put it back up while we explored, and no one would know that we were in there. We pushed out one of the boards quite easily. Clearly, no one had been keeping up on the security and structure of the place either. The smell hit us immediately. It's not something a person might think about, but a building or structure that sits stagnant like that ends up getting its own smell. And when you do this frequently, like we do, you kind of anticipate what smell you might get. At first entering the hospital, there was this sickly sweet odor mixed with some kind of chemical, and it actually made my head hurt. It was a hospital, so chemicals and cleaners did make sense. But the smell of something potentially rotting away always puts me on edge. It could very easily be an animal, but it could also be something worse. Turning on our flashlight, we scanned the immediate area, and it was looking like your normal abandoned place. Graffiti on the walls, debris, wreckage. There was even a spot that looked like someone was once sleeping in there, but they were now long gone. We passed what looked like the reception area and went into a long corridor lined with doors. Patient rooms. Most were either locked or jammed. Unfortunately, doors and windows seize a lot when not in use. But then we walked further down and around a corner where a sign that once hung from the ceiling was now on the floor. The chain that it hung from looked like rust had eaten away at it. The sign said, "Overnight stay." So, more patient rooms, we assumed. But these probably had better beds than the ones that we had already checked out with those paper runners on them. That's when the whole vibe of the place started falling apart. We entered the first room that was pretty empty, and a few others that had stuff here or there scattered around. But then we entered one room that had us pretty puzzled. The bed was still in the room, but was now on its side, and one of the side barriers had a pair of handcuffs attached to it. Pretty crazy with that alone, right? Well, then there was the wall behind the bed that had decent-sized dents in it, with dark, streaky stains running down them. The dents were at head level. It looked like the streaks were attempted to be wiped up too, but that clearly made it worse. I remember us both looking at each other with a sense of, what the hell happened in there? It felt really weird being in that room, like we weren't supposed to see it. We left the room and moved through the other ones. There was another room that was pretty much empty except for some kind of mat, like a yoga mat, in the corner. And there were scuffs on the floor in a circular pattern. It was as if it was worn that way from something going in a circle around the room. Someone was walking in a circle, or being dragged in a circle, maybe. Like the pattern on the floor was worn off or scuffed, if that makes sense. It's still weird, but we went on. Once we finished looking through the patient rooms, we found the hall leading to what we assumed were the offices of the doctors, and some sort of nurse station. The nurse station looked pretty empty, besides a few post-its that had fallen to the back of the desk wall. One of the notes had a medication request on it, and I remember the feeling that everything just seemed to abruptly stop existing in that place. Like everyone left in a rush and questions were never answered. Then we explored the offices, expecting to find something cool. Maybe old papers, research, maybe even different diagrams to take as a reminder. But I didn't want anything from the room that we looked through. There was a filing cabinet that had a broken lock. It appeared that someone had yanked on the handle and dented up the part where the lock mechanism would be, possibly using a crowbar or something to the likes. There were a few loose papers in there, not much information on them. It appeared they must have taken the confidential papers at least, or I hoped they did. All the drawers and cabinets in the room were unlocked and didn't really have much in them. But the bottom drawer of the desk did. It looked like another one of those mats from the room that we saw earlier, but this one was rolled up and duct tape closed. At first glance, I'd say they did it just to keep it closed, but when Isaac pulled it out, we noticed two things. First was the weight. There was no way that this mat could weigh as much as it did. It was pretty heavy. And second, it wasn't an even roll. It was bulging out in some places, and you could even see the gaps in the roll. Something was rolled up in this thing. Curiosity got the best of us too, because Isaac set it on top of the desk, and we cut through the tape. As we unrolled it, there were random items within each part. A doll arm, a birthday card directed to a daughter, a few thumbtacks, a clump of hair, a piece of cloth with another one of those dark stains on it, a picture torn showing just a woman, clearly removing someone from the photo, and then a small switchblade that was open. Isaac went to pick it up, and I stopped him. I was getting some really sinister souvenir vibes from these items. With the items there, what I assumed to be a bloody rag, the picture, and the knife, this looked like it could have been evidence. This was definitely important. I don't think the other things we found were related, but they definitely helped with the creepy setting of the place. We talked for a second about what we should do. We had been there over an hour at this point, looking through everything, and I was no longer feeling safe. It wasn't the fear of getting caught, but more so the fear of whomever left these items coming back for them. And what if they caught us in the act? Thankfully, Isaac was right there with me, so we left the mat unrolled where it was, sitting on the desk. We picked up our pace and started walking back toward the window. Standing by the board, I started picking it up when, from behind us, we both heard a deep, angry voice say, "Who the hell are you?" We didn't even turn around. I chucked the cheap board to the side, jumped out the window and looked over my shoulder just enough to make sure that Isaac was right behind me. Once confirmed, I took off running, no longer caring who saw us. We ran around the building, through those woods again, into the parking lot. We both looked around to make sure that no one had followed us before we got in the car. Once clear, we got in and drove off, driving around different streets, stopping at different stores just to prevent being followed. After we had calmed down, I drove back to Isaac's and we both went in. We went over everything we saw and that we heard, confirming that I wasn't the only one who heard the talking. I explained my theory on the rolled mat, and he also agreed that they seemed like they were souvenirs. Then we had to figure out how to report it. We weren't supposed to be there, and we could get in trouble if we admit it, but what if those items were part of a crime? I couldn't live with myself if I didn't tell somebody. So I looked up the anonymous crime solver number for our area and reported that a friend gave me the info about the items, and that they had just recently found it, and that was that. I kept it anonymous, of course, so I never had any follow-up with anyone. I also never saw or heard any news about that hospital or evidence being found, so I don't know if anything happened. I want to believe that it wasn't anything like that it was just someone keeping some weird items. Maybe someone that's not all there. Or maybe even that it's someone messing around, but the choice of items just put me off. We never went back there, but it was never reopened or remodeled. In fact, it was demolished, and now it's just an empty field, taking with it so many unanswered questions. When I was 14 years old, I was spending a couple of days with my favorite aunt. She was single and had a cute dog named Flip. The first day I was there, she had to leave for a short time for an appointment. I didn't want to tag along. I said that I would stay there with Flip. She asked me to take out the clean laundry from the dryer as soon as it was done, and then put the wet laundry that was in the washing machine into the dryer, and then fold the dry laundry. I agreed. In a short time, the dryer buzzed. I removed the big pile of dry bath towels from the dryer and tossed them onto the couch in the living room. I made a stop in the kitchen to get myself a glass of ice water. When I got back to the living room, I was dumbfounded at what I saw. All of the towels and washcloths were neatly folded and stacked on the couch. I couldn't understand how that could possibly happen. All the doors were locked, and anyway, who would break into the house and then fold the laundry and leave? I looked at Flip, and he looked back at me, wagging his tail. Suddenly, I was filled with anxiety. I snatched up the dog and ran outside. I stayed outside in the front yard with Flip until my aunt returned home. She seemed surprised to see me out front. I began to explain to her what happened, and she interrupted me saying, "Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it would happen while you were here." She explained to me that sometimes things were done for her while she was busy or away from the house. Dishes washed, laundry folded, the bed made. She didn't know what was going on with that, but she thought that it might be little people. She had begun leaving treats for them in the back porch. This was a very odd occurrence. Has anyone else had a similar experience? Hi, Raven. This story takes place about 2 years ago. I was 20 and on the way to go out drinking with my friends. I used to take the bus to get to the train station, and from there I would take the train to the city. Thankfully, I don't have to do that anymore as I moved to the city with my boyfriend. My memory is not the best, but this story has stuck with me as it was always really strange, and honestly kind of terrifying. As usual, I showed my ticket to the driver and sat down in my usual seat, which was the one directly behind the driver. There were not many people on the bus, just me, a guy my age sitting across from where I was, and 3 girls who looked about 15. I put on my music, ready to relax by myself until I got to my friend's house. I remember the driver pulled into the next stop, which I vaguely remember was a little weird in the moment, as nobody had pressed the stop button, and nobody was waiting outside the bus to get on. The bus driver was parked for about a minute before he stood up, walked back in the bus past me, toward the teenage girls. He started to yell at them, saying, "Hey, I can hear what you're saying. I know you're talking about me. I have cameras." I know for a fact they were not talking about him, because my music was not that loud and the bus was quiet. Even if they were talking about him, it's really strange for a bus driver in his 50s to stop the bus, get out of his seat, and raise his voice at some kids. Now, I have encountered some bus drivers who seem like they're in a bad mood, sometimes even yelling at passengers to buy a ticket, to sit down, or that you shouldn't press the stop button if you're not really getting off. This is not really unusual, but this in particular got my attention. Why on earth was he scolding these kids for nothing? I turned my music off, turned my head, and saw these girls looking confused at each other. One of them said, "What? No, we weren't." The driver was not satisfied with that answer and kept insisting, his voice getting louder. "I have cameras. I know you were talking about me," he said. The girls kept denying it, and their voices were shaking slightly in fear. "I know you were talking about me. I heard you," he kept insisting. At this point, we had been stopped for about 5 minutes, and he was just getting angrier. One of the girls started to cry, naturally, as this would be a crazy confrontation for anybody, let alone some innocent kids. I do realize that I should have probably said or done something. This is not an okay thing to do at all. But honestly, I was frozen in my seat, completely perplexed by the situation. Finally, the unthinkable happened. The driver was red in the face and yelling at these poor children when he reached for his belt and started to unbuckle it. I was in shock. What the hell was wrong with this guy? Luckily, the guy across from me stood up and pulled him away from them, asking him what the hell he was doing. The driver wouldn't talk to him or even look at him. Instead, he tried to go back to the driver's seat and keep driving as if nothing happened. The guy pulled him once again away from the seat and was blocking him, telling him to call his boss and tell him what he had just done. The driver tried to push him away and force himself past him, but the guy blocking him was a lot stronger than he was. At this point, we had been stood still for about 20 minutes. I know this because the next bus was behind us, and that driver stopped to see what was going on. The guy tried to explain what was happening, but the other bus driver seemed to think that it was not that serious, and tried to calm both of them down. The bus going in the other direction also stopped, and that driver came to see what was going on as well. I was still sitting in my seat, thankful that the guy across from me stopped him from getting back in the seat. I don't like to think about what would happen if he wasn't there. Was the driver planning on taking his pants off in front of these kids? The third bus driver called the police, as there was no way they could solve this by themselves. The creepy driver was still yelling and pushing the guy that had stopped him, and the guy pushed him back hard. They both pushed each other out the door, and the guy knocked the bus driver down into the ditch. The police arrived, and we all stepped off the bus. The girls were standing there in shock, and the guy tried to tell the police what had happened. I called my mom to ask her to drive me to the train station, and she did. Our local online paper later posted an article about the situation, claiming it was not serious and that no physical fight had happened. I have a video on my phone of the guy knocking the bus driver to the ground, and briefly debated showing it to the cops when I was there, but then realized it would probably only get him in trouble, when he was only trying to protect the kids. I went about my night with my friends, but I could not shake the situation from my head. What could possibly have gone through the bus driver's head to not only think these teenagers were talking about him behind his back, but also to aggressively confront them about it, and worst of all, start unbuckling his belt? Was it drugs? Psychosis? Just overall a terrible person? All I hope is that he lost his license and never gets to drive another bus again. Thank you for taking the time to read this, Raven. Me and my boyfriend listen to the podcast almost every night to fall asleep, and I really appreciate what you do here. Well, thank you for listening. Historical Analysis Number 2. The Sumerian-Akkadian Collapse. The Prototype Collapse. So, we just finished talking about the wide sweeping devastation that led to and resulted from the cascading failure of empire after empire across the Mediterranean and the Levant. But what if I told you that wasn't the first time something like that had happened? It had happened before. A couple of times, actually, but the first time wasn't near as dramatic or devastating. The second time was much more fire and fury-like, but in a more localized sense than devastating an entire region for decades. Yes, there is actually a very specific prototype to the late Bronze Age collapse. The story of the Akkadian Empire is impossible to tell, though, without talking about their forebears, the Sumerians. The city builders. If not for the Sumerians perfecting the art of urban design and living, then civilizations such as Greece and Rome would never have been as impressive as they are. While Rome had its entire pantheon of gods, the true religion of Rome was that of urbanization. I digress slightly, but my point is that the Sumerians were the original cult of city building. Chapter 1. Introduction to the Sumerians. At the end of the last ice age, a group of people suddenly appeared kind of out of nowhere along the Persian Gulf, in the land between the rivers, or Mesopotamia. What made this group of people so strange, so alien, was the language that they spoke. There was no other language anywhere in the region that was remotely similar to this complex dialect these newcomers spoke. Really weird. This kind of thing doesn't happen very often. Instances of language isolates are incredibly rare. They also brought something entirely new to the region: written language. With this entirely new skill or societal tool came an entirely new profession: scribe. Not everyone among the newcomers could read or write, and the ones among them definitely held elevated positions in the Sumerian society. Then came the cities: Eridu, Uruk, Umma, Lagash. Ancient centers of power, each with its own king and its own god. They built sprawling urban centers, ringed by monolithic stone walls, the images which would be passed down and made even more epic in the ages to come. Legends of strong-walled Uruk would inspire cities much later on, such as Jericho, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. This ancient civilization came into Mesopotamia and completely changed the course of its development. It brought an end to the nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle with the introduction of agriculture. Once the people began to plant and cultivate grain, and they no longer had to migrate with the game and wild crops, everything changed. And Sumer began to annex and integrate the surrounding societies and tribes. But the Sumerian language, as I said, was highly complex. It was very difficult to learn to speak, read, and write. Only the most privileged were ever taught, or at least taught successfully. But this would eventually be the downfall of Sumerian society. Another language emerged spoken by the lower-class citizen, eventually the military, and over time it became the most widely spoken and written language in the region. That language was Akkadian. As the Sumerian way of life began to diminish, so too did its language and culture. Eventually, this new language would mark the beginning of a new civilization. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. As the Sumerian period began to close, the city of would rise to be the center of power for a new king, one that would lay the foundations for the first known empire in human history. But it's important to take a moment here and just put this entire period into context. At this time, Stonehenge was just a series of barrows and earthworks. The monolithic stones we all know and recognize wouldn't be put in place for another millennium. The pyramids of Egypt couldn't be built for another 900 years. The last woolly mammoths were still clinging to life on the island in Siberia. The Sumerian culture that was collapsing was already ancient at this time. In fact, from the time the Sumerian civilization collapsed, going back to their origin would be comparable to us going from our current age back to the age of Julius Caesar. But when they finally collapsed, it was pretty complete. Their language was gone, but fragments of their culture, their world, echoed down to us with words and professions, such as scribe and winemaker, all brought with them from their mysterious land of origin. But in large part, the Sumerian culture was gone. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, over 1,000 years later, the final woolly mammoth on Earth lay down and died. Sumerian culture had arrived, flourished into a world-changing phenomenon, and collapsed in on itself quietly all before the last mammoth on Earth passed away. Oh, and as a little fun fact, it was the Sumerians that gave us the word barbarian, because they equated the sound of non-Sumerians speaking to that of a dog barking, thus the bar-bar-ian. Little fact I absolutely love. So, if you ever use the word barbarian, you're actually speaking Sumerian. Chapter 2. Lugal-Zaghazi, the King of the Land. In order to cue up the next part of the story, I have to do another miniature bit of context building. Sumer had never really been a unified empire, never answered to one monarch above all others. Everything was insular. Each city its own state, with an independent king and its own various subcultures. The first man to build a true land empire of any scale was the warrior king of Lagash, a man called Enadum. He was a brutal ruler, and he was the first to conquer a series of cities and integrate them in a way that we would think of as at least a small empire. By this point, the majesty of Sumer had fallen. One of its golden cities, strong-walled Iraq, had risen to prominence and hosted one of the largest populations, and was one of, if not the largest city on the planet, and then fell as other cities and kings rose. This period of Lagash being the center of power would last for a century and a half. The empire that Enadum built was fragile, however, and overextended in ways that only invited rebellion. And a man, the king of Yuma, would take that opportunity to take his own chance to build an empire. That man was Lugal-Zaghazi. Awesome name, right? Well, he was the Toyotomi Hideyoshi of the Sumerian city Umma. And for the sake of Raven, I'll just call him Lugal for the rest of this. Thank you so very much, that's hard to pronounce. But Lugal began as a lowly cupbearer. From here, he worked his way up to governor of Umma, and eventually the king. But Lugal then went on to do something that no one else had ever done before. Not even the Enadum. And while Sargon the Great gets the credit for creating the first empires in history, I would argue that it was Lugal of Umma that did that. And now I will show my work. From ruling Umma, Lugal then began to conquer the other city-states of Sumer, Uruk, Lagash. This, for the first time, brought most of the Sumerian cities under one banner. But Lugal's complete uprooting of the old system effectively brought an end to the old way of life, and set the stage for something far greater. He also did something that no one before him had ever done. He proclaimed himself the king of the land. Though his reign would be even shorter than the reign of Lagash and its kings, starting with Eonatum, he effectively declared the formations of the first empires ever in recorded history. Lugal-Zaghazi was the first, so get wrecked, Sargon. Chapter 3. Sargon of Akkad, aka Sargon the Great. Now, we move on to the man that most historians call the builder of the first empire in history. Obviously, we personally think that Lugal was the first, but we're only dealing with a matter of scope. That, however, is the academia stuff, and we're not here for that. We're here for a damn good story. And a damn good story it is. You see, what we have for Sargon's origin story will actually sound quite familiar to a lot of people. Centuries before the story of Moses would ever be recorded, the legend of Sargon says that a baby was born to a priestess. Due to her standing as a religious figure, she could not acknowledge that the child was hers. The baby was then placed in a basket of reeds and was set adrift along the river Euphrates. Later on, the basket was found by a humble farmer by the name of Aki. This farmer took the infant, Sargon, into his care and raised him, teaching him various practical skills the boy would need to succeed in the world. This was a secure, if humble, raising, and you could say that it went on to serve Sargon well later into life. All through his life, Sargon claimed no divine lineage. You could say that he was the first one to use the old son of a plumber line, although, in this case, it would have been son of a gardener. At some point, as he grew up, Sargon found himself in one of Sumer's most prosperous cities, Kish. This is where we start to see dreams of something greater beginning to show through. Now, Sargon has a very interesting parallel with Lugal. They both started as cupbearers for their respective kings. The king that Sargon found himself serving was Ir-Zababa, and I do want to clarify that being a cupbearer actually sounds less glamorous than it is. The cupbearer was often privy to sensitive information heard during private meetings with the king and his advisors. So it's probably from this that Sargon began thinking, hey, it would be good to be the king. There are stories that say that even Ir-Zababa began to fear Sargon, and after he had a dream that Sargon killed him and usurped the throne, that the king tried to have Sargon slain. Unfortunately for Sargon, the attempt failed. Now, that's not a confirmed fact, but it is an interesting bit of the story, even if it may be a healthy amount of speculation and relying on folklore to tell us what actually happened. Now, for this bit, we have a bit of a murky timeline, but it would seem that during a conflict between Ir-Zababa and Lugal-Zaghazi, that Sargon capitalized on a chance. Along the way, Sargon had built a coalition of other Akkadian-speaking people, and he rose up in rebellion against Ir-Zababa. And after triumphing there, he turned his sights to Lugal, the other undisputed power in the region at the time. Chapter 4. The First Empire. At this point, Sargon of Kish had his sights on the big bad of the period. The man that, like him, had risen from humble origins to a king, Lugal-Zaghazi. The battle did not end well for Lugal. Sargon had gathered up the following of Akkadian-speaking men, and he went to war with Lugal, and he toppled the self-proclaimed king of the land, and he humbled him, taking him to one of the most spiritually important cities in Mesopotamia at the time, the city of Enlil himself, Nippur. Lugal was paraded to the city in chains and presented as an offering to the king of the gods himself, the god that the Sumerians said created the world, and was the god of the air. In less than 20 years, Lugal-Zaghazi had gone from unifier to humbled prisoner of war. From here, Sargon would systematically raise the magnificent walls of Uruk and other cities, including Yuma, Lagash, itself having already been ravaged by Lugal-Zaghazi as retribution for what Lagash and Eonatum had done to Yuma a century before, Ur and other strongholds of Sumerian culture. This was both incredibly symbolic and very strategic. It was symbolic as he wiped away the last vestiges of Sumerian security. The walls that had protected their way of life for centuries were now gone. It also ensured that no one from those strong-walled cities would ever be able to rise up and challenge him. Much like Hideyoshi, Sargon greased the rungs of the ladder, making it impossible for anyone else to ever do what he had done. What Lugal Zagizi had conquered, Sargon now consolidated and built upon. Having destroyed the walls of the ancient seats of power, the cities of gods and men, the new king of the land built his own city. This city was Akkad, or Agade, but for this script we'll refer to it as Akkad. And what makes this city so fascinating is we have no idea where it was, or where the ruins of it might be. Some speculate that it could be north of the traditional Sumerian heartlands, possibly between Kish and Babylon. By building this new city, this new gem in the land between the rivers, Sargon was officially declaring that the age of the Sumerians was over, and their civilization as ruined as the once mighty walls of their greatest cities. And while the location of Akkad remains one of the great mysteries of archaeology, the effect it had on the region would live on long after it had vanished. The scribes of later times refer to Akkad as the city of kingship. This set a standard that kings of later empires, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, would follow. Even in the age of Assyria, many kings did this, starting with their most sacred city, bearing the name of their patron god that would go on to supplant the mighty Enlil Ashur. Later on, the city of Nimrud would be elevated to the city of Assyrian might, and even later still, an entirely new city would be built by Sargon II of Assyria, called Dur-Sharrukin. Sargon was so inspirational that later on the king of another great empire would take his name. That is how influential Sargon the Great ended up being. Nearly 2,000 years after his rule, he was inspiring other men and other kings. Something else Sargon the Great was the first to do was that he formed and maintained the first standing army, the Sons of Akkad. It was over 5,000 men strong. Until this point, armies had been seasonal levies. Wars could only be fought in narrow campaign seasons that usually started just after the planting in spring and before harvest came in the cold winter after. For the people of this ancient world, this presented a bit of a problem. If you marched your sizable but seasonable force to a city, and they just went behind the walls and locked the gates, and you couldn't break the gates quickly enough, you would have to turn around and march back home. Sargon changed all of that. Imagine the first walled cities he marched upon. They lock their gate and stand on their walls and just wait for the Akkadians to break camp and go home to work their fields. But then the campaign season ends and the Akkadians are showing no signs of leaving. That must have been terrifying for the citizens that dwelled within the cities that Sargon aimed to conquer. Elsewhere in the world, the Indus Valley civilization was at its peak. The city of Mohenjo-Daro wasn't the ghostly graveyard that we know today. It was a thriving urban center that had direct trade with Mesopotamia. While Sargon was building his empire, Indus ships were probably sailing into ports along the Persian Gulf, as Indus seals have been found at several Mesopotamian sites. In Egypt, the Great Pyramid is now 200 years old, and the Old Kingdom is still flourishing. For the pharaoh Pepi I, the monument built to Khufu was already becoming ancient. Meanwhile, in China, they were building their first walled cities, but were still centuries from the first dynasties that would be so famous in later millennia. While Sargon was smashing the walls of the old world of Mesopotamia, in Britain they were dragging the massive stones that would complete Stonehenge. They were just coming out of a Neolithic age, and the use of early bronze tools was spreading, marking the very early stages of the Bronze Age in the very early United Kingdom. Chapter 5. Ruin. Sargon would rule for about 50 years, and then his son, Ramush, would rule through blood and violence. Sumerian cities that had never been accepting of Akkadian rule began to rise up, and Ramush answered the way any man of power in Mesopotamia would. with blood and fury. Tens of thousands are said to have been killed in the cities of Umma, and Lagash. Despite his gusto in suppressing the dissidents, Ramush himself would be assassinated in the kind of court intrigue and conspiracy that would make Brutus proud. This puts another of Sargon's son, Manishtushu, on the throne. He was more of a builder than a warrior. That's not to say he didn't have his military successes, of course, but his reforms and building projects would earn him enemies of his own. And like Ramush, he would be the victim of a court intrigue and was also assassinated. At this point, the question's beginning to take root. Akkad is conquered, now can it rule? It was now the turn of one of the most famous of Akkadian kings to try and answer this question. Naram Sin, another really cool name I think, came to power as the grandson of Sargon the Great. Naram Sin, the man who audaciously proclaimed himself king of the four quarters of the world, would push the empire to its greatest reach into Anatolia, Syria, and Elam. His success marked the true golden age of the Akkadian Empire. But as with so many civilizations across the world at any given time, once it peaked, it immediately began to decline. Do you recall how Lugal proclaimed himself to be king of the land, only to be ousted by Sargon? Well, in a rather ironic mirror of that hubris, Naram Sin would proclaim himself a god. Many people would later say that it was this arrogance in the face of the old gods that started Akkad's decline. The later years of Naram Sin would be plagued by chaos. The 4.2 kilo years drought hit the region and crops failed. Not only Mesopotamia felt this particular event. Even the Indus Valley began to wobble. Fractures in the old kingdom of Egypt were beginning to appear as well. Naram Sin's son, Shar-Kali-Shari, inherited this chaos. As fractures in Akkad's invincible facade began to show, one of the region's most feared enemies, one described as wild mountain dragons, the Gushans began to harass and cause problems all over Akkad. Sumer was in full-on revolt, and Shar-Kali-Shari was destined to spend his entire reign fighting fires on every front. And we're in a massive drought, so those fires are really hard to put out. We'll never know just what kind of king Shar-Kali-Shari could have been, as the majority of his reign was spent trying to bring the empire back to heel and fighting off the barbarians of the Zagros Mountains. And after his death, all of his efforts crumbled beside the empire he had tried so desperately to save. After he died, the empire fragmented. The Gushans gutted most of the empire's carcass and dominated the region for nearly a century. The drought persisted, and the Akkadian cities dwindled in population. And their most sacred city, the one that symbolized its might and dreams of dominance, vanished completely into the mists of time, taking with it the hope of kings and god-kings alike. Akkad ruled for 180 years before it collapsed. And the next 80 years would be Mesopotamia's own Dark Age as Gushan tribes ran roughshed over the land and between the rivers. Then, the light of a new age began to dawn. The Sumerian culture wasn't quite done just yet. It would have another golden age when the III period dawned. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. Hey, Raven. So, when I was 19, my boyfriend and his friends were really into motorcycles. They weren't the most financially responsible, but they absolutely loved riding. We lived in Southwest Florida at the time, and my boyfriend had found a listing for a new bike that he wanted to buy in Miami. We packed up my parents' Subaru Outback and drove across town to pick up his best friend, who we'll call Bobby, which I wasn't super excited about since he and I didn't get along very well. As anyone who lives in Southwest Florida knows, the quickest way to get to Miami is by Alligator Alley, a long road that goes straight through the Everglades. For being such a main road, it almost feels strangely desolate at times. So, that day, After my boyfriend successfully bought the motorcycle and we spent the evening in Miami test riding it, it was time to make the 3-hour drive home. Bobby and I took the Subaru while my boyfriend rode on the motorcycle alone since I forgot my earbuds and I didn't really want to sit in the wind on the back of the bike all the way home. Still, I wasn't really looking forward to spending 3 hours in the car with Bobby either. We didn't necessarily hate each other, but it did feel like a sibling rivalry at times. We began the long trek out of Miami and into the dark and desolate highway that is Alligator Alley at night. There's one gas station on that road, which feels like it's in the middle of nowhere, but it's on the Native American reservation grounds and sits on the canal that Alligator Alley runs along. We decided to stop and fill up our gas and regroup with my boyfriend to chat about who we would drop off at home first when we got back in town. It was late at night already, and the gas station was in the process of closing as we got there, so we were the last customers. As we sat and ate snacks before finishing the drive home, the gas station employees drove home and the lights turned off, leaving us in darkness other than our car headlights. My boyfriend started to pack up his gear, and we said that we would meet him on the road as we packed up as well. Knowing that he would want to test the speed of his new bike, as expected, his taillights disappeared into the distance by the time we got into the car. Bobby went to crank the keys, and the engine sputtered and died. He tried again. Nothing. Oh no. We checked our phones. No signal. We were really in the middle of nowhere. We stepped out of the car in the dark, and I shined my flashlight around, and a pair of eyes glinted back at me from the canal. Grunting and snorting sounds bubbled up from the water. That's when I remembered that it was alligator mating season, so they were more aggressive than usual, and we were deserted in the middle of the night with no cell service. Just us and the alligators. There were 3 of them from what we could see from where we stood, not wanting to get too close to the canal as they just floated there watching us. We needed to get out of there. Lights started approaching in the distance. "Bobby, there's a car!" I yelled, and I ran to the shoulder of the road, sticking my thumb out. This was 2020. No one was stopping for hitchhikers or helping anyone. 3 more cars passed within the hour that we sat there, all of them ignoring my waving hand and outstretched thumb. Our last hope was how Bobby explained he knew of Native American reservations about a 2 hours walk ahead. But he was very sure strangers arriving in the middle of the night were definitely not going to be welcomed, even if we appeared to just be some kids. I feel bad for this now, but the way he explained that it's a tight-knit and guarded community, and being a naive and scared 19-year-old girl, knowing we were in deep southern rural Florida, I imagined being greeted by an angry man with a rifle at their gates. Despite this worry, we set off on foot along the shoulder of the highway. Our phones had already died at this point from the flashlights draining the battery, so we were only guided by moonlight, occasionally hearing the grunting of the gators in the canal below. After about an hour and a half of trekking through whatever lies on the side of the highway, I couldn't believe my eyes. Up ahead, it seemed like there was a cop car. No lights were on, but the way it was positioned on the shoulder, and by its shape and the white color, I hoped that it was one. Bobby worried out loud that it was an empty one parked on the road to scare people to slow them down, but my hope prevailed. We approached it and knocked on the window, and to our surprise, and to hers as well, I'm sure, a lady rolled down the window. She asked us what we were doing out here. We explained how our car broke down at the gas station. She seemed suspicious of us at first and didn't seem to want to help us. She said that there wasn't a nearby gas station, and we explained that we had already been walking over an hour. She rolled her window back up to talk to someone on her radio, and I wondered what else we could even do if she was unwilling to help. After about 10 minutes, she rolled the window back down and told us to step into the back of the car. It was unnerving riding in the back of a cop car, especially with how suspicious of us she seemed until she pulled up to the gas station, and indeed, there sat the Subaru. She was able to help us jumpstart it and made sure that we got on our way. I was thankful that she helped us, but could not shake the creepy feeling of the dark and the gators watching us, waiting for one of us to just slip all night long. I had a pretty weird cousin growing up. Actually, calling him weird is an incredible understatement, and this story will explain why. I will refer to him as Andy. Andy is 5 years older than me and was my aunt and uncle's only kid. There were a lot of cousins, all of us pretty close in age, but he was one of the oldest ones. With our difference in age, and him being a guy, me a girl, there wasn't really a time that we played together, at least not that I could remember. Maybe when I was a lot younger. Andy always gave me this weird vibe, one that I couldn't quite articulate as a kid. It was just this instinctive sense that I didn't want to be alone with him. Nothing ever really happened, but the feeling was always there. And maybe that's why. As we grew up, he would bully me a bit, making comments mostly about my body. Things like how I looked like a boy, or that I was flat-chested. Being younger, I didn't quite understand some of the things that he was saying, but I know that I hated being called a boy, and he knew it. But the older we got, the creepier he would get. When I was 12, he could say that puberty hit me pretty hard. Andy noticed, too. He made comments about my body, would make weird hand gestures at me that I always yelled at him for. He even told me that I was going to be hot when I grew up. It always made me incredibly uncomfortable because he would only make these comments and gestures if we were alone or when my younger sister was around, because she didn't understand what was going on. I would walk away every time. I would mention it to my parents, and every time I would get the same response. My mom would tell me to just ignore him because he's expecting my reaction. And my dad would tease and say something along the lines of, well, boys will be boys. I was frustrated that he was never confronted about it, but all I could do was stand my ground and avoid him whenever possible. It was 2002 and I was 14, and my family had moved into a bigger and nicer house. My mom was pregnant, and we lived in a 2-bedroom prior. I certainly wanted my own room, and my sister, now being 7, was going to need her own room as well, plus a nursery for the new baby. The house was amazing, and I loved my room. I could have had a larger room, but I chose the smaller one because it had a bay window. And to me, it was the perfect place for me to store my favorite dolls and books. And because we had a bigger house, my family was going to be hosting Thanksgiving that year too, which meant that Andy would be there as well. I had already prepared for this. I asked my sister Katie if she wanted to have a sleepover in my room, and she excitedly said yes. I wanted to protect her from Andy as much as myself, worried that he might start picking on her too. That day, I helped her bring her pillow and favorite blanket into my room, as well as some of her toys and colors. People started coming over. Some of them had been there before, such as my aunt and uncle and Andy. They had actually helped us move because my uncle owned his business and had a big truck that he let us use. That meant that Andy was around during that summer, unfortunately. He was just as bad, making comments about me, as well as our new neighbor, surprisingly. And it wasn't like she was the neighbor's kid or something close to his age. No, this was an adult woman. She looked a little younger than my mom, but as far as I could tell, she lived alone. I never saw anyone else coming and going, but Andy would always make gross comments about her. I would tell him to stop or something to the likes, and he would tease that I was just jealous that I wasn't getting the attention from him. Just a reminder that he was, at this point, 19 years old and making these comments about an adult and his 14-year-old cousin. So, when he showed up that Thanksgiving, after he made a gesture towards my chest, he then asked about the neighbor, as if I knew her whereabouts. When he started making his gross comments, I walked away, calling for Katie so we could lock ourselves in my room. We stayed there for most of the day. We snuck snacks into my room and only came out for dinner or to use the bathroom. There was also the rare occasion that someone might come in to see us, but that was it. Andy was not allowed in there. It was the one thing that my parents actually agreed on, that no one was allowed in my room except them, unless I allowed access, which is why it was a safe zone. Anyway, we were in there doing whatever until we exhausted all of our forms of entertainment. It had been several hours, so we decided to come out to see who all was still there. Unfortunately, Andy's parents were still there, which meant that he was too, but we decided to risk it and went to the side den and watched TV. We could hear the adults talking in the kitchen, and could even hear some of the other kids playing out back. I had a few other cousins around my age and younger, and assumed the rest of them that were still there were outside. As long as it meant that Andy wasn't around us, I didn't care. But as we sat there, we could hear sirens in the distance. It really wasn't a big deal. Living in the suburbs, you hear sirens sometimes, but then there were more sirens, and they got louder and louder. Then they stopped abruptly, and I could actually see the red and blue flashing lights through the window. I was curious what was going on, and went to look out the window. I could see that the lights had stopped in front of our neighbor's place, and I wanted to know what was happening. I left the den and saw the kitchen was also empty, and went out the front door where the adults were, now standing in the yard looking over at our neighbor's home. I approached the adults, and with our neighbor's home being at a slightly higher elevation, I could see her standing by the ambulance, wrapped in something and clearly shaking and sobbing. I was scared that something happened to her. She was a very nice lady. She waved at us when we got off the bus, and she let us pet her rabbits that she kept on the back patio. The adults all talked, and I don't even know what they were saying at the time. I just remember watching and waiting for answers. Finally, that would happen, when, to my horror, 2 cops walked out of her house, with my cousin Andy between them, handcuffed. He was smiling, laughing even, and making these weird sounds that I really can't explain. It was like this weird gurgling and growling or howling sound. He looked terrifying. My aunt, his mom, also noticed him and started screaming out for him and ran toward the gate, ready to run up to our neighbor's home. I stayed behind watching as my uncle followed, as well as another aunt and my mom. They all talked. My uncle yelled, "What did you do?" And my aunt cried. Andy was put in the back of the cruiser, and they left. Everything after that was a bit of a blur. The adults told us kids to go back inside, and my grandma kept us in the living room watching a movie. The other adults stayed out front for a while, and then came in with a cop and continued talking. Eventually, people slowly left, and my mom told us to go to my room and get ready for bed. She later came in to tell us goodnight, and I asked her what happened. I just remember her looking very sad as she told me that Andy did a very bad thing. I tried to push for more information, and all that she said was that he had hurt someone. That was the last Thanksgiving that Andy attended. In fact, I hadn't seen him for many years, because that night, Andy had been arrested and charged for breaking into our neighbor's home and assaulting her. She had managed to distract him at some point, locked herself in her bathroom, and climbed through her small bathroom window to escape. She went to the neighbor's house on the opposite side, asking them to call for help. I don't know why he stayed in there. Maybe he thought that she would come back out. Who knows? That was never mentioned by him, I guess. I learned this when I got a little older, too. I got pieces of it as I grew up, until my grandma finally filled in all the blanks. There was definitely a divide in the family after that. My aunt still felt like there was nothing wrong with her son, and that there had to be some kind of misunderstanding, where most of the family said she was crazy if she didn't see what was happening right in front of her. My parents would talk about it, and mentioned how there was clearly something wrong with him. And it just made me so angry. He had made so many gross comments about me, his 14-year-old cousin, and I told them about these situations, and they always just brushed it off. It could very easily have happened to me, and I am thankful that it didn't, but that doesn't mean that I feel better about it, because our neighbor became a victim instead. I actually never saw him until I was in my 20s, at my grandfather's funeral, and I still avoided him until we had the celebration of life. I spotted him talking to my sister, Katie, and he had that creepy grin on his face again. I immediately approached and snatched my sister away before he made a comment about me looking good. Now that I was older, I wasn't afraid to kick him where it counted if he tried anything. Thankfully, he avoided us after that, and I never saw him again. I don't know where he is, and every once in a while I search the county records, expecting to see him locked up again. So far, nothing. And I don't even know if that's good or not. All I know is that he needs some serious help, and I'm not confident that he's going to change without it.
Hello, Raven. Surprise, this isn't Raven. This is another entry from my old journal, which again, I'm really glad I found because so many of these entries inspire nostalgia from crazy things that have happened in my life. And then there are these stories where I kind of put myself into the crazy situations by being curious or daring. I elaborate on these journal entries for detail, mainly because when I originally wrote them, I didn't ever think I'd share them with anyone, and I didn't want to forget what I experienced back then. So, I tried to be as descriptive as possible. As I read through these again to share for the channel, I'll of course elaborate on details that weren't as clear to my younger self. As always, this is a true story. Urbex life is somewhat simple. You hear about an abandoned store, warehouse, mall, or anything, and you either drop what you're doing and immediately go check it out, or if you're more experienced, you plan a day to go do so. For those who choose the latter, you're able to prepare a lot better, and sometimes even find out local lore or details about the places you're going to explore by using good old Google for some insight. This took place in fall of 2013. A former friend of mine and fellow student named Ashley, who we all called Sparrow, told me about a hospital that she and her boyfriend drove past while on the way home from visiting family. Apparently, there was a rumor that the hospital closed due to lack of funding, and there were a few old rumors about medical malpractice and potentially there being some lawsuits that shut down the hospital. But I didn't need to be convinced to want to go. Sparrow said abandoned hospital, and I said, heck yeah, let's do it. The other thing was that there apparently was a morgue beneath this hospital, as many often had in their basement levels, and Sparrow was insistent that we check it out, which was a deal breaker for her boyfriend who didn't want to deal with a morgue, But still, I wanted to check out the rest of the building in general. Truth be told, I hated hospitals in general. But something about seeing one that was abandoned seemed exciting. So we planned a weekend visit, packed our gear bags, and I spent the night at Sparrow's house with her boyfriend, who adamantly insisted we change our minds. We didn't. The next day was a mildly cooler day, and the trees, of course, were turning colors and shedding leaves like a bad fashion statement. And an hour or so past noon, Sparrow drove us to a small grove outside of town and headed down a short, tree-lined road that seemed to separate us from the current world. Sparrow made one final right turn from that winding road onto the hospital entrance road, where the abandoned hospital stood in all of its derelict glory, nestled among a few overgrown trees in an equally overgrown parking lot. I remember how excited Sparrow was as she parked near the back of the lot and all but rushed out of the small Toyota RAV she drove, and we grabbed our bags from the trunk. It was a smaller hospital building with several floors, and it looked like it was built sometime in the 80s or 90s, with the brown-red brick look that spoke of decades of use. I remembered wondering why the road into the hospital wasn't fenced or blocked off, as is often done with abandoned properties. But our excitement to get into the hospital overrode our objections as we began half walking, half jogging to the circular front drop-off area. This is where we experienced what I've mentioned before as the distancing, which, for anyone who hasn't heard any of my Urbex stories, is what my friends and I used as a term to try to describe the feeling of stepping into the frozen time that seems to be trapped around an abandoned property. As if you're leaving your current time and entering into a time and place stuck in the past or forgotten by the current world. Some of you may understand this, and for any fellow Urbex peeps out there, I'm sure you know that hard to describe feeling I'm talking about, which words fail to capture. The older the building, the more that sensation of distancing from the current world you'll feel. I digress. One of the front wooden panels on one of the main entrance doors was pushed in, so we entered through there and stood in an open space that was obviously a front reception or waiting room of sorts, and began to look around. The first thing I notice about most abandoned places is often how silent they are first and foremost. And in a world full of noise, hearing something so still and undisturbed can be a little unnerving. Next on the list of unnerving things was the smell, which started off like stale urine or an unflushed toilet and seemed to grow the further in we went. Sparrow and I kept close, watching our steps and looking through the windows of closed rooms and open doors of others, all of which were either partially or completely empty on the first floor, and we found a stairwell at the back end of the first floor's hallway. Remember, this building is abandoned, so there's little to no light outside of bringing a flashlight or headlamps like we wore, since we believed in being hands-free during our explorations. Sometimes you'll get ambient light through windows or holes in the roofs, but multi-floored buildings are usually very dark inside. That being said, flat out, right off the bat, stairwells in abandoned buildings are creepy, dark, and feel ominous. So, without our headlamp, it was almost completely dark. Sparrow wanted to check out the other floors one by one. And to be fair, I'll skip the uninteresting ones. The second and third floors were completely empty, apart from basic debris, and the room doors were all opened. There were some areas that had fallen in, ceiling tiles and hanging light fixtures and wires, but ultimately, nothing too exciting. The third floor had a lot of ceiling tiles missing, some graffiti, and a few leftover hospital beds, which Sparrow and I found confusing, because she said those beds were expensive. We also found a fully stocked vending machine that looked like someone took a chainsaw to it, and a Coca-Cola machine with the front cover wide open, and everything inside of it was empty. There was a room that had a biohazard sign on the door, but the door looked like it was kicked in, and inside the room, all of the glass on the cases were broken, and the floor was littered with both glass and small pills. We were careful walking through this floor, since it seemed to have more debris in the hallways too. The fourth floor was where things got interesting. The first thing I noticed was that the damage on that floor seemed more deliberate and egregious. I remember the holes in the walls. The hanging light fixtures seemed more like they were ripped down rather than falling from lack of maintenance. The floors were scratched up and stained. Some had miscellaneous papers, trays, and even what we figured out were syringes strewn about. And overall, it looked like total chaos had been unleashed. The room doors were all dented, and they looked like they took a beating. One was even propped on the door frame and looked like it had been removed from the hinges forcibly, and there were piles of trash and other indistinct debris all over the floors. One room near the far end of the hall had windows that were busted out, and air from outside was coming in, and that's when we saw the backpack and water bottles that were filled with what we assumed was urine. Sparrow said that judging by the layers of thick dust coating these items, someone was probably squatting here a while ago and left their gear. We reached the end of the hallway, and this was the first time we noticed the elevator doors. The shaft was actually open, and even as curious as Sparrow and I were, we apparently drew the line at going to take a look down the shaft. We headed back to the stairwell, and Sparrow said instead of going up to the fifth and final floor, she wanted to go check out the morgue. That way, if we started losing daylight, it wouldn't be too dark. I know I skipped through some of the details of the less interesting floors, but in real time, we were in this building for a few hours. Enough for us to notice the golden haze of sunlight, signaling that the evening was approaching. The plan was that we'd check out the morgue, since it was honestly the initial highlight of this trip, and then, if we felt like it, hit the fifth floor or see if there was roof access to a helipad or something like that. We stayed in the stairwell, which, again, in an empty building is creepy enough, but as we approached the first floor, I remember hearing what sounded like running on one of the hallways above us. Sparrow and I froze because, as far as we knew, we'd been alone this entire time. There were a few distant shuffles, and then the building went eerily silent again. Sparrow and I exchanged looks, and I could tell she was using her eyes to plead with me to hurry up and go to the morgue, and I told her that her faces only worked on her boyfriend, but I agreed to still go. As we descended the last sections of the stairwell, that scent I mentioned earlier in this story that was reminiscent of stale urine or an unflushed toilet got stronger and began to add whiffs of what I tried to describe as spoiled meat. when I originally wrote this journal entry. We were back on the first floor, where the stairwell didn't go any lower, and Sparrow didn't waste any time looking around the hallway just outside the stairwell exit. Long story short, there was a door further down a hallway at the rear of the hospital's first floor that had another staircase behind it, leading down to what we concluded was the basement morgue. If our eyes didn't find it, our noses definitely did, since that horrible smell from earlier that seemed to permeate the front lobby was stronger by the door. There was a missing panel to the right of the door, which we assumed was where the security lock for the door had been ripped out, and the door itself, though still intact, wasn't locked. We didn't know anything about protocols for hospitals, but we did find it interesting that the morgue wasn't accessible from the main stairwell. Again, I digress. We, of course, entered the morgue stairwell, hearts pounding, and feeling a mix of adrenaline and uneasiness, since this was the first time we'd seen a morgue in real life. And as we rounded the corner of the final steps down to the metal door, which looked untouched, but was strangely open. The lock mechanism for that door was also missing, but once we opened the door, we were simultaneously slapped in the face with a whole new level of creepy and an aggressively horrible smell of mold and something sour and rotten. I remember the gagging sensation when we opened the door, as if the air was pulled out of our nostrils and replaced with hot garbage and rank food. It was unusual to say the least, but it's not the first time an abandoned place had an odor. Just the first time we'd been in an abandoned hospital, so we had no idea what to expect. Ahead of us was a hallway, and there were a couple of rooms from what we could see from our headlamp. Also, just a note that it was pitch black down there, and without our headlamps, we wouldn't have been able to see. The air was stale, and both Sparrow and I looked at each other again in the glow of our headlamps and decided to press on. The room on the right was empty, but had two giant fixtures coming out of the ceiling, which we took a minute to examine since they reminded us of the lights we saw above operating tables in hospital TV shows. The floor was slick with dust, and insulation from where the roofing tiles above had fallen down, and the floor also had some dark brown or black stains on it that we did our best to avoid. The room across the hall was similar, only the giant light fixtures were missing, and there was a giant collection of empty cabinets on the far wall, which we didn't bother to touch or explore. Further down the hall, we found one more room that was so filled with clutter we couldn't go in. Random boxes, furniture, and what looked like refrigerators were piled up inside the room, and the rank smell seemed to be concentrated between this room and the last room up ahead. The final room on the hallway was the room we simultaneously were dreading and yet excited to find. We recognized the neat rows of stainless steel doors and the body freezers on the far side of the wall of this longer and slightly wider final room. Strangely enough, the room itself was empty, save a few odd tables, like carts with wheels on them, which we didn't know what they were for. All of the freezer doors were closed, and I remember exchanging looks with Sparrow again. She seemed to be mesmerized, elated even, staring at the morgue freezers with genuine intrigue. I have to admit it, It was the first time I had ever seen anything like that in person, and I actually wrote in my journal that all I was hoping in that moment was that Sparrow didn't want to open one of the coolers and that nothing was in them. The world will never know because we didn't touch them. There was a fear that came with seeing what we saw, a heaviness that said, "This is your limit, don't push it." And we knew that there were certain things you just don't want to find out. The odd smell wasn't lost on us, since if anything was left down here for as long as this place was closed, it definitely would have rotted. But as we returned to the main hallway, we saw that the end of the hall actually turned right and led to what looked like a larger elevator further down, which was blocked with more of the refrigerator-looking items. And I remember the random wheelchair sitting in the hall in front of the unusual blockade. We decided to head back up to the main floor after this, and considered our exploration over at this point, since we could go no further. We exited the morgue level and went back up the stairs to the hospital main floor, and finally made our way to the front lobby. We looked around again, noticing the front lobby area had less outdoor light coming in due to the setting sun outside, and then exited the abandoned hospital and walked back toward Sparrow's car. Apparently, we weren't alone in our exploration after all, because upon arriving at Sparrow's Toyota RAV, we noticed that the driver's side window had been broken and her door left open. Strangely enough, nothing was missing from her car, and it didn't look like anyone tried to hotwire it either. To this day, it still confuses me why that happened, but Sparrow's boyfriend gave her an earful about it after she dropped me off at my place and went home to him that evening. About a week after exploration, Sparrow ended up telling me she wasn't going to do any more Urbex after one of our martial arts classes together, and then I didn't see her for another week after that. She ended up blocking me on social media and never responded to any of my calls or texts, and then eventually blocked my phone number as well. It took me a couple of months to figure out what happened, and our head instructor at the martial arts program we trained in finally told us what happened to Sparrow. She'd gotten sick not long after our exploration, and though she was bedridden for a couple of weeks, she recovered, and then her boyfriend got sick right after, only he didn't recover the way she did. It apparently got so bad that he had to be hospitalized and eventually flown out of state for treatment. Sparrow went with him and moved permanently out of state. Our class was saddened to hear the news, and our instructor told us that was all she had told him in a single text she'd sent explaining her absences. After class that day, I remember he asked me to hang back a bit to talk, and he asked about if I knew anything else about Sparrow, since he knew I hung out with her and her boyfriend outside of classes. I told him that he knew more than I did, and that Sparrow had already blocked me months ago after telling me she wasn't going to be attending classes or going on any more explorations. I did tell him about her car being broken into, even though nothing was stolen, and he nodded but didn't say anything back. To this day, I still don't really know why Sparrow blocked me, though I did suspect that maybe something from the hospital made Sparrow sick, and maybe she brought it back to her boyfriend. I don't know, but I was there too, and I didn't get sick at all. My standard practice was to shower immediately, trash bag and launder anything worn on an Urbex trip, and disinfect shoes since we end up walking around in places that are unsanitary and often messy. Either way, that's my story from 2013 about the hospital from my journal of unusual experiences.
Hey Raven, I wanted to tell you about my cousin and her boyfriend at the time. My mom's side of the family is huge. We are talking 50 plus people, from aunts and uncles, great aunts and uncles, first, second, and third cousins, plus all the grandparents and one great grandparent were still around at the time of this story. Parties and holidays were always an open invite. It was easier than having to track everyone down. I grew up with this, so it's what I've always known. Another part of my family tradition, we live in Florida, so our family Thanksgiving is a little different from others. We practically have a cookout at some park. Everyone chaotically decides who brings what, including the meat. One year my uncle even deep-fried a whole turkey. They can get pretty crazy. So this particular year was going to be my great-grandma's 99th birthday. Her birthday was the 28th of November, so she typically got a small personal cake on Thanksgiving, just for her. We made plans this year and pushed to make sure that everyone would be there because, as we know, life is fickle, and we wanted everyone to spend time with her. So, everything was going as planned, and surprisingly smooth. I was bringing my girlfriend with me, and while she had been to other parties with my family, this was going to be the first Thanksgiving she would experience. I did warn her in advance at how busy it would get. They rented out a shelter as normal, and when we arrived, there were a lot of people already there and setting up. There were a lot of younger kids that typically kept themselves busy on the playground. I was 23 at the time, and on my own, but I always loved kids and watching my cousins and siblings. So, it was nothing different when I showed up, and my younger cousins, or even my cousins' kids, came over to hug me and drag me to the playground with them. One cousin I was quite close to, Jody, was 2 years older than me, but we used to spend a lot of time together. We stayed at each other's house and played together until she was 15. Sleepovers and playing with dolls were no longer something she was interested in, which was sad at the time, but when I hit that age, I understood. So these gatherings were something that I looked forward to because I could see her and hang out with her for a while. While my girlfriend, Lindsay, and I played with the younger kids, I spotted Jody get out of a car with a man driving. She waited for him, he put his arm around her waist, she smiled, and they walked together toward the group. Time certainly got away from us. I hadn't seen her in a few years, but I had seen her parents, my aunt and uncle. I would ask how she was, and they were short, saying that she was good and that she was trying to find herself. They also joked about how I should try to get her a job where I worked to keep her busy. As far as I knew, she was still living with them, so I assumed they just wanted her to get a job and help pay for stuff around the house. I worked as an assistant at a pet grooming store. I had been there for a few years at this point and moved up pretty quickly, while I was going to school, too. But otherwise, I didn't know much about her anymore, and what she had been up to. So I wanted to go see her, introduce her to my girlfriend, and then catch up. We managed to escape the kids and made our way to the shelter and started making our plates as I waited for my chance to jump into the conversation. But as we approached, I noticed a few things. First was the change in mood around the adults. Where they were just laughing and being loud, most of them had become quieter, and you could feel the tension in the air. Then I got a better look at the man that had arrived with Jody. As a reminder, Jody was 25 at this point, but the man had to be close to or over 40. At first, it was strange to see, but who was I to judge? She was an adult, and could choose to be with whoever she wanted. Hell, I clearly wasn't straight, and I'm sure family members had opinions about that, too. But I think the part that was more uncomfortable than anything was how they acted. They couldn't keep their hands off each other. He always had his hand on her waist or in her back pocket. They would kiss between each bite, and just honestly, they made things a bit awkward when others tried to talk to her. Even when I approached her and hugged her, she reciprocated, but the guy barely moved back enough for us to do so. She quickly introduced me to her boyfriend, Hank, and I introduced Lindsay. We talked for a moment about what we were doing with our lives, and somehow we ended up on how they met. Apparently, Jody was actually dating Hank's son, who was her age, but then they ended up together. Okay, so that was a little weird to me, but the conversation got awkward when Hank asked how we met and tried to get more details about our life, including our bedroom activities. I know I was uncomfortable. So was Lindsay. And Jody just laughed, like she was totally fine with this. I ended up making some excuse for us to leave, and we walked away. I apologized to Lindsay, but she wasn't upset like I was. I was pretty crushed. Jody was not the same person that I grew up with, and it was painfully obvious by her interests and how she acted. I had to remember that we weren't kids anymore and people clearly changed, and I just had to accept that. We moved on with our day and went back to the kids, talking to anyone else that came around. It wasn't until a few hours later that our conversation with Jody was in the back of my mind, and we were back to having a great time. Until Jody approached us over by the swings. At least it was just her. She didn't have much to say, just asked if I still had the parakeets when I was younger, and then asked if I had an iPhone charger. I told her I had one in my car and went to walk away to get it when Jody stopped me. She said that she would get it, so I handed her my keys. She was still my cousin, and all she asked for was the charger, so I didn't hesitate on letting her grab it herself. She took my keys, thanked me, and walked away. Attention back towards the kids. It was probably a good half hour, and after talking to others, Lindsay and I started to help pack up some of the food and make our own containers to take home. She asked me for the keys to unlock my car, and that's when I realized I didn't get them back from Jody. No big deal. Maybe she forgot too. I started looking around for her and I couldn't find her. I couldn't even find her boyfriend. I asked a few others and no one else had seen her either. But they did mention how she also asked them for something too. A charger, a lighter, something from their car. Some of them had their keys back, but most of them did not. Strange. Jody was missing, and so were a lot of our keys. Some of us walked over to the cars to see if we could find her. We certainly found some keys, but it's what we didn't find that threw us all off. The cars were unlocked. Some keys were still in the seat or by the door, but they had been cleaned out from the inside. My radio and CDs were gone. Some of the kids had left their games in the cars, and they were gone. Everything of value from our cars was gone. And Jody and Hank were missing. I was devastated. Did they really steal from us? From family members? There were a few cars that weren't touched, including her parents. Her dad was immediately angry and tried to call her from his phone. Of course, no answer. That's when they shared a bit more of their dynamic with us. Her parents were also aware of how they met, but They did not approve of their relationship. Hank was almost the same age as her dad, and he did not like the guy. She had moved back in with them. I wasn't aware that she ever left, but I guess she did when she was dating Hank's son. Now Hank tried to stay at their place, and they wouldn't let him. Only her. She constantly relied on them financially. She had totaled her car that they got for her because she was driving drunk, and they bailed her out on that one too. She wasn't working, and when they tried to get her a job, she either didn't do the interviews or blew it on the first week. But up until that day, she had never stolen from them, nor gotten in trouble for theft. I was shocked. She was no longer the kind and funny girl that I grew up with. Those of us that could leave did, especially those with kids, but I stayed to continue to help out, especially after such a somber moment for all of us. Some of us debated on if we should report it or not, and ultimately we did call the cops. No one saw them do it, but we did say that we had our suspicions. I went home with Lindsay and trying to lighten the situation by explaining that that was not something that normally happened at these gatherings. We found out that Jody didn't go home that night, or the rest of the week, for that matter. It wasn't until she was caught shoplifting that she phoned home for help. I didn't see Jody after that. It was hard to forgive her, let alone face her. She pulled off this whole scheme, whether Hank was involved in it or not, and managed to rob several family members in one day. It became a Thanksgiving that we never forgot. We continued to have these large gatherings, but she never showed up to them. She did show up in the local newspaper, after being a suspect in a homicide that my mom had showed me. She wasn't charged or found guilty, thank God, but we still have no idea how she was involved. It was pretty terrifying to see that we had both grown up together, lived close and very similar lives, but how different our paths split around the same age. It's one of those stark reminders about the choices we make and how they can impact others around us. Historical Analysis 1. The Late Bronze Age Collapse and the Sea People. Chapter 1. The Darkening Sky. Now, indulge me a bit while I set the scene, the backdrop against which there was not a single catastrophic event, but a cascading failure of multiple civilizations in the Levant region. This was a region that was dominated by incredible powers, empires that had ruled for centuries. What could possibly happen that could bring down 4 of the greatest empires in history and leave 3 so badly diminished and weakened that they themselves didn't fully survive? In fact, all of the empires touched by the late Bronze Age collapse either fell because of it, or shortly after because of the shockwaves it created over the entire eastern Mediterranean. So step back to a time when empires still reigned supreme, with their monarchs and emperors that had carved up the known world into this delicate balance of power, made secure by trade, deep financial ties, or marriage alliances. The elite controlled the bronze, which was needed to make tools and to smith weapons and armor. Resistance wasn't just futile, it was downright foolish. Now come with me as we go back to around 1200 BCE. All across the eastern Mediterranean, a widespread drought is ravaging the great empires. Egypt's legendary granaries are nearly empty. The cities of Hattusa and Mycenae, palatial cities, starve faster than the farmers that once fed them. The Hittites are already dealing with political infighting, and their court is dissolving into factions when the famine that follows the drought hits them. They were doomed. Egypt was also dealing with unrest after Ramses II's rule ended, and the power vacuum was eroding the system from within. They were trying to field massive armies abroad and a growing population at home, so again, once drought and inevitably famine hit, it emptied those granaries completely. Babylon was struggling under the pressure of their on-again, off-again ally, overlord, vassal in the north, Assyria. They were also dealing with threats in the east, where Elam was sniffing for blood in the water. In places where tensions are already high, and a disaster like drought-induced famine rocks three empires, the powder keg will ignite. And when it did, a panic spread and rivals no longer held back, frantic to try to loot what little the others have. Societies fracture internally as those dwindling supplies got lower and lower. In the end, neighbor turned on neighbor. Food riots would have been breaking out in Ugarit, as well as the ancient Phoenician city-states of Tyre and Byblos. Damascus's thriving markets are barren, looted for any valuables. The zoos of Nineveh were empty. Its occupants starved, possibly even consumed to feed the starving city. Even the very trade networks that had allowed all of these great powers to thrive were not as secure as the empires liked to think. In this era when bronze was king, copper was fairly plentiful. However, tin was the all-valuable and rare component. It had to be shipped in from places like Afghanistan, Iran, or Central Asia. Central Anatolia is also a possible source, but once the social and political problems started, there was no way it could have been considered a stable producer. And once it became harder and harder to source the tin, as that systemic stagnancy began to take root, well, no more tin, no more bronze. No more bronze, no more weapons. No more weapons, no more army, and so on. The social order would literally start crumbling from the inside as public order began to slip, bit by excruciating bit. But then, when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, they got much worse. Beyond the Mediterranean in the North Atlantic sits Iceland. On the south of that island lies the gateway to Hell, the volcano known as Hekla. Even now, Hekla's dangerous, still alive. Since the 9th century CE, there have been 20 major eruptions from the mouth of Hell. Clouds of ash that darken the sky for years. Streams of liquid fire gushing from the molten mantle beneath. And back in the 12th and 11th centuries BCE, Hekla was even younger and more unstable. More powerful. Younger volcanoes have fewer established vents to release their pressure, and so when it finally erupts, more of the heat, ash, and magma are forced through the point of least resistance. And so not only was Hekla 1,000 years younger, but it also sits right along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, one of the most seismically active spots in the world. And this takes us to 1159 BCE. I want to pause here just for a beat, and remind everyone of the lens that we're looking through here. A combination of anthropology, geology, and archaeology tell us that these great Mediterranean empires began showing strife around 1200 BCE. So the problems were already brewing for nearly 50 years by the time we get to 1159. And remember how I said things got much worse. Okay? 1159. Iceland. Hekla. What would come to be known as the Hekla III eruption happens. Along the western Mediterranean, as well as along the Atlantic coast, you could have looked up at the sky and only just barely been able to see the sun through the haze of ash and soot that filled it. Over hundreds of miles, ash would have rained down like snow, blanketing fields, villages, and even cities. Crops would have died in the ground. Livestock would begin to starve as all the greenery suffocated under thick mounds of soot and volcanic debris. The Levant was already suffering from drought and famine, and even the eastern Mediterranean would not have been free from the climate effects, nor the social ones. People from the west began to flee their starving homelands. In desperation, they began to form their own little communities, their militias, fighting forces that were hungry with starving families. Well, if you can't farm yourself, you ask yourself, what else are we really good at? And after thinking for a moment, you remember, we're really good at building boats. And you sail east, looking for lands where maybe the sun still shines, where maybe the land isn't covered in the gray snow that kills all things. Chapter 2. The Sea People Cometh. If you were on one of the boats fleeing the devastation of Hekla, all your hopes pinned on a new start in the far east, and if you were expecting the exotic and rich land of silk, spices, and the rarest purple dye in the world, well, you were going to be disappointed. What you would have found instead was a series of lands equally ravaged by famine, plagued by war and unrest. What you would have found was ripe pickings and easy targets. If you were one of the citizens living along the eastern Mediterranean coast already starving, watching the fabric of your society beginning to fray, you would have looked out and seen black ships looming on the horizon, and you would have thought that the gods had truly abandoned your people. The boats land, and then true hell is unleashed upon your home. And cities like Pylos and Corinth are all suffering the same fate as the ones they dubbed the Sea People, set to raiding all along the Greek coast. Laconia, aka Sparta, would only skirt a direct raid by virtue of its inhospitable stance towards the sea. Go figure, Sparta being inhospitable. Athens itself would be spared the destruction by virtue of luck, maybe? It's not really clear just why Athens wasn't one of the victims of the Sea People. The sacking of Pylos was especially devastating because Pylos was one of the 3 palatial cities that dominated the Mycenaean Empire. It wasn't as well defended as the cities of Mycenae or Tiryns, but its loss was just as devastating. The cascading collapse of coastal economic centers and the often rocky relationships between cities spared pillaging destabilized the Mycenaeans so much that, between devastation in the south and seismic damage to Mycenae and Tiryns, when northern tribes, the so-called Sons of Alexander, the Dacians, and the Dorians, and others, swooped in, the Mycenaean Empire, the conquerors of Troy, collapsed into history. Just to add further devastation to Greek civilization, the Cyclades were next on the agenda for the Sea People. One by one they hit them. Naxos, Paros, Santorini. None of them are well fortified. All of them flush with wealth, food, luxury goods, all vulnerable to a quick strike and fade style attack, which the Sea People were very good at by this time. What was once the gem of the Minoan civilization, Crete was not to be spared the wrath of this new Mediterranean naval power. One by one, all of the great cities and trade ports began to fall. Some of them would never recover. Even the ones that would were never the same after this era. Cyprus was ripe pickings for them. Once the mighty center of the copper trade that was just as vital as the rare tin for the creation of bronze was reduced to near nothing in the wake of the marauders. Byblos, Tyre, Ugarit, they all fell to the Sea People. Byblos and Tyre both still exist today, however. They are the longest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. Even at their lowest point, there were always people calling the ancient streets home, even if they were only poor beggars and scavengers barely eking out a living. Once these cities fell, the struggling behemoth that was the Hittite Empire collapsed alongside Mycenae, into the ash pile of history. The Assyrians, too, another of the most powerful empires in the region, began to stagger under the economic collapse of Tyre and Byblos, whom they depended on for their access to maritime trade. The Assyrians were one of the empires that was shrewd enough to survive, but not for very long. They withdrew back into their heartlands and weathered the storm as best they could. Even Elam, the farthest inland empire, was rocked by the waves generated by the collapse of the all-important coastal cities. Although there was one great opportunity that presented itself to Elam during this time, the glorious city of Babylon. At the time, Babylon was languishing with the floundering Kassite rule. It mostly existed in the orbit of Assyria, although they never passed on a chance to play Elam and Assyria against each other. Elam took an opportunity and they sacked Babylon. But they didn't stop there, no. Elam and the other empires and city-states had long had a tradition in war. When they attacked and sacked a city, they would always take the statue of that city's god with them. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Assyrians would usually then just weave this new captured god into their mythology. Well, Elam took Babylon's statue of its god Marduk with them back to their capital Susa. Babylon itself survived, trudging on under various dictators and dynasties. Although, centuries later, it would once again emerge as a dominant power with the Neo-Babylonian Empire. But that, as they say, is another story. In many ways, I think it was Egypt that really stands kind of head and shoulders above the other empires at this time. You see, the Egyptians weren't altogether unfamiliar with the Sea People, or at least some of the tribes that were now part of this large marauder army/navy. Some of those tribes had actually fought alongside the Egyptians as mercenaries, and some of them had also fought against them in the same capacity. Ramses III, as pharaoh of Egypt's new kingdom, wanted to live up to his predecessor and namesake, Ramses the Great. And when the black ships appeared on his horizon, sailing towards the Nile Delta, he did the only thing he could: rally every army he could muster, calling all banners for a massive pitched battle against the Sea People. The battle was brutal. The victory was costly. That cost paid in the blood of the Sea People and Egyptians alike. But, at the end, it was the Sea People fleeing while Ramses III stood victorious on the Nile Delta, watching the surviving raiders climb into their boats and sail back over the horizon from which they had come. Chapter 3. The Iron Nail. We've looked at so many events in the chain of cascading failures of the late Bronze Age. The fragility of trade routes that fed the entire economy of the palatial cities, the likes of Mycenae and Hattusa, but also the all-important trade routes for copper and tin. The lifeblood of the bronze trade. The trade of the elite nobles and imperial families who could afford the artisan smiths that could smelt the bronze and fashion it into weapons and tools that put the world at their feet for centuries. Well, when the bronze trade collapsed, there was a vacuum that had to be filled. Everyone knew that iron was plentiful. It was literally everywhere across Anatolia, Greece, and the Levant. The problem was that iron takes a much higher heat in order to smelt it. Before the collapse, the Hittites had been experimenting with smelting and forging iron tools and weapons. They had even gifted iron weapons to some of their allies. And so here, at the end of the Bronze Age, we see the great equalizer take to the field of battle. Ironsmithing had finally started to spread, and now with this metal that was not solely under the control of wealthy merchants and imperial families, warfare was, in simple terms, democratized. Now you could either make or buy a much cheaper and more easily produced iron weapon. And while iron wasn't stronger than bronze, it was far more readily available to a larger number of people. What really pushed things heavily into the Iron Camp and made the Iron Age inevitable was when the secrets of steel were discovered. Once people figured out how to add carbon, everything changed. Iron and steel brought the final death blow to the Bronze Age empires that had ruled the world with their imperial fists for so very long. The secrets of steel would later, very famously, reach what could be considered their highest peak when Woots from India made its way west along the Silk Road and reached Damascus, where legendary smiths created a truly amazing and now lost metal, Damascus steel. Some call it the greatest metal ever smelted, and the blades it forged are the greatest ever made. It's sharp enough to slice a silk scarf, yet tough enough to cut through chainmail armor. The Crusaders feared and envied it. When they saw the smoky water markings of curved Saracen blades, they knew they were in for a long and hard battle. but I digress. Although I think I've managed to put quite a nice little bow on this one, we'll wrap it up and we can get on with our day. This leads us to the epilogue, the legacy of the Sea People. I just wanted to take a minute here to circle back around to the Sea People. They really deserve more conversation and spotlight than I was able to give them earlier in this script. Simply because stopping mid-beat to really talk about them would have completely wrecked the narrative I was trying to build. But so often, people like to just kind of say, oh, the late Bronze Age collapse was the Sea People's fault. And it's just so much more complex than that. And it completely vilifies people that were just as much victims of the ecological impact of years' worth of famine and darkness. Granted, they did become some of the most famous raiding peoples of all time. But it was the desperation that drove them to that point. We do have to take that into consideration. The environmental problems didn't just affect the Levant and Greece, it impacted all of Europe and Central Asia too. It was a pretty widespread time of hardship. And we also have to remember that one of the more famous, not necessarily as great as his predecessor perhaps, kings of Egypt immortalized the legacy of the Sea People in his battle against them on the walls of his tomb. That says they were fierce. They were worthy foes. And the Sea People didn't necessarily just vanish into the mist of time, as some of the empires that they touched did. One tribe in particular eventually found their way to the land of Canaan. The Paliset, as Ramses III called them, are said to have later become the Philistines of Old Testament fame. Maybe at the end of the day, they were the only real power that truly survived. Because their legacy began at the dawn of the Bronze Age collapse, and it continued long after Mycenae, the Hittites, Ugarit, or Assyria. And if that's not immortality, then what is?
I wanted to share an event that was kind of my first experience with urban exploring. This happened back when I was around 6 years old, so in the early 2000s. I know that seems absurd for Urbex, but hang in there with me. It's been 2 decades, but I swear, I remember every detail like it happened yesterday. I'm pretty sure my mom still doesn't believe me, but I know what I saw. I know what happened, even if I couldn't quite explain it at that age. This happened over the summer. My dad was the main worker, but my mom cleaned houses when requested and when she was available. She was great at it, but I remember it being a pain as a kid because our house was always so clean and spotless that she would be stressed if she saw toothpaste spatter on the mirror. But that's just how she is, and it could definitely be worse. Typically, when she was cleaning a home, it was when we were all at school or daycare. I was the youngest of 4 kids and had a half day, and my mom had a house to clean. I got the details of the job in the house when I was a little older and understood better. She was paid to help clean out someone's house that had passed away. The thing is, it wasn't like the person had been living there, then recently died, and was not being sold or something. The person that owned the home was moved to some sort of hospital where they died, and the home actually sat abandoned basically for years. My mom told me that they were willing to pay her a good chunk of money for this place, which is why she agreed to take it. She just said she was under the impression the place was more empty and literally just needed to be cleaned. However, that was not the case. There was still a lot in there, and they asked her to get out as much as she could, but said that she didn't have to worry about the furniture, appliances, or any large items. So, she did what she could, and on this day, she had my dad help her since he was off. I don't remember why, I just remember her being happy to have his help with both the house and with keeping an eye on me since I would be out of school. So there we were at this house. They had set up a small area for me in the yard to play and stay out of the way, while also keeping an eye on me, or so they thought. I walked with them through the house as they talked about the best way to tackle certain areas. When we went upstairs, we looked at a room that was clearly for a young child. It had a teddy bear wallpaper with pastel green paint. There was one of those small foam fold-out kids recliners that I always wanted in the corner. It was the Lion King themed, and an old light-colored trunk against the back wall that looked covered in stickers. My mom was just showing my dad the rooms, and they were discussing what would work best and what she needed him to do. My thought process was that I just wanted to go through that trunk and play on that chair, but I was told no. She said it was too dusty in the house, and she didn't want me playing around in there. I pouted, but there was nothing else I could do about it. Until a little later, when they were both too busy to realize I had snuck off. I told them I needed to use the bathroom, and at that age, my parents were quick to show me where to go. But I was also capable of doing it myself, so after my mom showed me where the bathroom was, she walked away, telling me to go back outside when I was done. I could hear them busying themselves, moving stuff around while I was in the bathroom. They had already cleared out one room and my mom was vacuuming it. That was when I took the opportunity to run up the stairs behind them when they wouldn't notice. Now, alone on the floor above them, I was free to explore the rooms on my own, which was exactly what I did. I went back to the kids' room I had seen earlier and started looking through stuff. I opened the closet because I had a small tub in mine filled with toys and expected to see the same, but there were just some old clothes hanging up. So then I went and folded out the foam chair, ready to make myself a place to chill with whatever toys I found. Then I moved to the trunk, ready to dig in. But here's the thing. I didn't want to alert my parents that I was upstairs. So I kept the light on in the bathroom, but didn't turn the lights on upstairs. So the room wasn't completely illuminated. The only light coming in was the light coming in from the windows that only had some of those old plastic blinds on them that were open. So not completely bright in there, but I wasn't in the dark either. I actually didn't scare easily, which is weird to say as a kid. The dark didn't bother me. I didn't have issues with monsters or bad dreams waking me. So being in a room that was a little darker, I was totally fine with. But what I learned that day was that I was not comfortable with the feeling of being watched. I had started going through the trunk, and while there was more clothing in there were also a few toys present, including some kind of dinosaur figure that had a moving mouth. I was holding it when I started feeling like I was being watched, and at first I thought, oh, I've been caught. So I waited to hear one of my parents call my name. But that never happened. So I slowly turned to look at what was staring at me. I was seriously expecting my parents, but there was no one else there. But what I saw, or didn't see, was more alarming and confusing. Something was blocking the doorway. It was tall, or at least it seemed tall to my little self. I could see a dark form starting from the floor. I could see what I thought were arms with very long fingers, but they appeared webbed with how they were attached. The shoulders looked very broad, and the head was round, no hair and no facial features. It was as if it was just a silhouette, but that made no sense. Based on the lighting, There was no reason for them to be in the dark the way they were. And to make it even more confusing, they were also slightly transparent. I could see right through them, right to the mirror hanging on the wall behind them, reflecting light from the window. So, how was this possible? Someone was standing there, but I could see right through them. The other thing I remember at the time was the smell. It was faint at first, but the more I focused on the figure, the stronger it seemed to get. It smelled kind of bitter or sour, with a slight floral or sweet smell mixed with something metallic. It made my teeth hurt. I couldn't quite make sense of it at the time, but as an adult, it became more disturbing to me. It reminded me of when my grandpa was really sick, and we saw him in the hospital. Then, when my mom helped take care of him at home. And lastly, when he passed and we went to a service. I now recognize that as being the smell of death in embalming fluids. And while all this was circling in my head, I was just staring at this thing, wondering why it wasn't moving. And for the first time in a while, I was actually scared. I didn't know what to do. It was blocking my only way out of the room. I stayed like that, standing by the trunk for what seemed like several minutes. Finally, the only thing that came to mind was to do what I was always taught, and that was to have manners. They were clearly blocking my way, so I did the only thing that seemed reasonable. I asked it to move. I remember saying, "You're blocking the door. Can I please go?" And I waited there. For a moment, nothing happened. It continued to block the doorway. But then, slowly, it began to move. I watched it move towards the left, away from the door frame. Once I could no longer see it, I slowly approached the door, looked down the hall where they went, and it was empty. I took that chance to run. I ran down the stairs as fast as I could and ran into my dad in the living room. He asked me why I was upstairs, and without looking at him, I told him someone was up there. He told me to go out to my mom, and he went upstairs. She looked just as confused, wondering why I was inside. Clearly, my parents had no idea I was still inside, so my plan worked, I guess. I was explaining to her what I did and saw when my dad came walking out too. He said no one was up there, and my mom told me to explain to him too, and I did. Both of them told me no one was there and that I was probably just seeing a shadow or something, and scolded me for going up there alone. I was told to not move from my blanket spot in the yard unless they told me I could, and that was that. When we went home, I tried talking about it a few times, but they always shut me down, saying I was imagining things and that was the end of it. But I know what I saw, and I know what happened. And maybe that set things off for me, but I have loved urban exploring since then. Finding old places and things left behind like that has always been fun, to try and think about its history or story. I haven't had much more in ways of paranormal experiences since then, but I will tell you, I will never forget my manners. You never know. Politeness might just go a long way.
I used to work overnights in a small medical billing office about 3 years ago. My schedule was usually around 6 p.m. to 2 a.m., and sometimes shifting a little earlier or later depending on need. The job itself was mind-numbingly boring. I spent most nights scanning medical documents and entering the data into our system. Very entry-level, but it got me to a better position for decent money, especially with that bonus since I worked overnight. I didn't have much of a social life and found myself up late anyways, so I figured doing something useful with my time would be better. And it gave me time during the day to do my normal errands. During the day, there were about 15 employees, but at night, the only other person that worked that late was a guy who processed insurance claims that left around 10 p.m. And then the janitor that came through to clean and sanitize everything. The building itself was an old house that the owner had bought and converted into office space. It really was a nice little 2-story building, and everyone worked pretty close together. But there was one night that had me pretty spooked, and I still can't make heads or tails of it. I came in at my usual time and noticed that the other late night guy, I'll call him Steve, was not in. I expected this, however, as he had recently mentioned taking some time off, so I was alone. It was around midnight. I had my headphones in and was mindlessly entering data when I heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway. Like I said, it wasn't entirely unusual as we had our maintenance guy / janitor that also worked overnight. I'll call him Mike. I had my own office, so he usually fixed up what he needed and sanitized, and I let him be. Sometimes we would have a short conversation in passing if I ran to the restroom or got something to drink, but that was about it. Now, one thing about Mike, he was an older gentleman and was very much the type that had a pattern. When he worked, he came in, hung his coat in the closet, grabbed his cart with his supplies, and whistled the same song. I still don't know what the song was, but I think it was some kind of gospel song, based on the very few lyrics that he sang. He always came in early because he would wheel his cart right outside the break room and make a pot of coffee and read the newspaper before getting to work. I could smell the coffee when he made it and would occasionally make myself a cup. Sometimes he would even stop by and tell me he made some, which got me up to stretch anyways. So, back to that night. I heard the footsteps and assumed that it was Mike, and thought nothing else of it. But after about half an hour, I didn't hear his whistling and nor could I smell the coffee. I remember pausing my music and looking at my door to see if I could see him, but I didn't. However, I could still hear footsteps. I stayed in my office for a while longer. When I still had no sign of Mike, I thought I would go check the break room myself. I walked in, and it was empty. The coffee maker was cold. Strange, but maybe something was going on, so I just went back to work. Shortly after I returned, I started hearing footsteps again. But it wasn't just the footsteps. Now I was hearing what sounded like something being dragged across the floor. It was a pretty frequent stomp, drag. Over and over. Like someone was dragging something around that was pretty heavy. So I leaned over my desk and this time called out, "Mike? Is that you?" And all the sound stopped. That is when it started getting creepy. The only person that would be there so late would be Mike, but his whole routine was missing, and he wasn't responding to me. Then, I did the thing that you never do in scary movies. I went to check it out once more. I was worried that maybe it really was Mike and that something was wrong. Or worse, it was someone who shouldn't have been there. I walked out of my office and around the corner to the hallway. At the other end of the short hallway was a more open area with a few cubes where the front door was. I followed the sound down the hall and turned the corner, and was certain that I was not looking at Mike. In front of me was a very tall and lanky person. They were facing away from me, but yet their knees were facing outward to the side, like they were bow-legged. But the movement seemed so unnatural. It was janky or twitchy. It was like watching a buffering video, but it was happening right in front of me. To make it all worse, they were dragging something behind them, but it was more like a pile. There was no defined shape, really, but it was covered by a blanket and then tied multiple times with some kind of rope, which was then being held by this, I guess, person over their shoulder. This explained the footsteps followed by the sound of dragging. I don't know why I did this, but part of me felt responsible. The building had normal locks on the door. No key cards or anything like that, so we just made sure the door was locked, especially at night. I was worried that maybe I left the door unlocked and that was how they got in. I called out, "Who are you?" The person stopped walking, slowly turned around, held a long crooked finger to his mouth and made a shushing sound. Something in that moment kicked in my fight or flight, and even being a full-grown man, that man towered over me. I ran back the way I came and left through the back emergency door. I knew when to pick my battles, and that was not one. I didn't have anything on me except my phone, so I couldn't even get into my car. I stood in the back parking lot and called 911. When they arrived, they searched the building, came out, and told me it was clear. I went in and explained what I saw again, and they took a statement. While I waited for them to clear the area, I had called my boss to report it as well. He showed up while we were inside giving my statement. Following the hallway, we found a pack of popcorn on the floor. It was strange because it was still wrapped up and unpopped. It was like it was dropped. We didn't have cash there, but the most valuable items were probably the paperwork containing sensitive data or the computers themselves. But none of them had even been touched. So what were they doing and what were they dragging behind them? After finding the popcorn, another officer checked the break rooms, and we were surprised and confused about what we found. They had cleaned out everything that was in there. Snacks, drinks, coffee pods, even the random food containers in the fridge were gone. The only thing that remained was a circle drawn on the counter with a dark, sticky substance, like a barbecue sauce, with a small bird skull in the center. According to the officer, it was a fake skull. Still, it looked pretty creepy, and we had no idea what it meant or why it was there. I had even walked in the break room on the bottom floor, where I was, and it wasn't there at the time. The cops wondered if maybe the person we saw had stolen the food and maybe they were under the influence of something, which would explain the way they were acting. My boss did file a report since we deal with sensitive information, and he contacted Mike to make sure he was okay. He was. He said that he was actually feeling ill and wasn't going to be at work that night. Part of me was relieved because him being older, I was worried what could have happened if he ran into that strange man. As far as I know, they still have no idea who that guy was and what the circle and skull meant. They never found or caught that guy, and I stopped working there about a year later. I was pretty creeped out that night, especially when I heard the door open, but you can bet your ass I never forgot to check the door either. I just wish, if they were looking for food, they would have asked for it, or at least taken it in a much less creepy way. This story takes place in my university economics class. I was taking this class while studying in law school, and this included many late nights, lots of revisions, and plenty of hours that were taxing on the mind and the body. My mind was often focusing so deeply on school and how busy my life was at the time that I may have made a bad judgment call. One afternoon, I was studying in the library when I saw a boy who I recognized from my economics class. We happened to be in there studying for a huge exam we had coming up soon, and it was an insanely hard exam that had us both stressed out. He recognized me and said hi. I asked how his studying was going, and he told me that he was struggling as well. When he suggested studying together, I agreed. despite my initial reservations. I think I let my guard down because we were both in the same boat, and I figured that it would be a good opportunity to study with someone. He then invited me to his dorm room to study, and for some reason, I agreed. As soon as I stepped into his room, I felt uneasy. The place was a mess, and it didn't exactly scream law student. There was very little inside, just a lot of clutter. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I tried to remain calm, and that's when I saw it. A massive stack of bank cards on his desk. I asked him about it, and he brushed it off, telling me not to worry. But I was worried. He then told me that he had a secret, and I should know that it was something serious. He claimed that he was committing fraud, and only studying economics and law to learn how to get away with it. That this was how he made a living, and that his enrollment in university was only to appear normal to the outside world. I was frozen in fear and wondering why he was telling me this. My fear turned to panic, and my suspicions were confirmed when he said that I now knew too much and that I had to help him with some money withdrawals to ensure my silence. I knew that I was in trouble, but I used my female instincts for protection and pretended to play along, trying not to arouse his suspicion. I gave him a fake email address and told him that I had to leave because I had to go home to prepare for the exam. I mentioned that I could use some extra cash and that we would talk later. He seemed skeptical, but I think he bought it. As soon as I left his room, I sprinted home terrified. I didn't sleep for weeks, fearing for my safety. I informed my employer, the university, and my close friend about the incident, hoping to cover my bases. I never saw him again, and I have no idea what happened to him, but that experience taught me a valuable lesson. Never trust strangers, no matter how friendly they may seem. My scattered student mind may have contributed to my poor judgment, but it was a hard-learned lesson that I will never forget. I've been listening to you for quite some time and have multiple stories that I could send, but this one to me is really the strangest, and I don't feel like I'm able to unpack it on my own. My whole life, I have grown up with the memory of myself at about 4 or 5 years old, hugging my mother in the hallway. I think I was sad about something, but I hugged her really tight, and I remember thinking, I have to remember this because I don't know how long she's going to be here. It felt like a nice thought at the time, and it stuck with me. Many years later, I decided to learn hypnosis. We could go back and forth in time and space and make all kinds of changes in our life. My first try, I had a reaction, which means that my heart was racing. I was shaking, I was crying, and that meant that I had a lot of pent-up energy that needed to be let go of. Luckily, my teacher offered to work with me directly within the first 20 minutes of class. He did a special technique to ask me to go back to a positive memory. Well, the positive memory was me hugging my mom and telling myself that she's not always going to be here. I continued with the exercise, realizing that was not a happy moment at all. That was a tragic moment. Like, what kind of 4 or 5-year-old thinks that? In the last couple of weeks, I realized, or I should say we found out, that she's been very sick. She has cancer. It's spread all over. I'm not sure how long she'll make it, but it keeps coming up in my head about why I had that thought at such a young age, now that I am very well studied. I have a very strong feeling that a future version of myself did a regression and went back and gave that young child that memory. The information, the advice that she needed to move forward in the most powerful, positive way. I've heard other stories of people doing this all the time. I really just don't have any explanation other than that. Seeing as how I've been training for 10 years, I could have done it at any moment of time. Or maybe I haven't done it yet. It may get done before or after she passes. Not your typical glitch, but worth sharing, I think. It's really been tripping me out, and I do think in some way I traveled in time to protect that younger version of myself. Hello, Raven. As promised before, from my old journal, I've got plenty of crazy stories to share. And in light of October being both my birthday month and the spooky season, I wanted to share a few of the stories that fit the mood. My apologies for taking so long to get to these, Fox. This was back in 2013, during the summer after my final semester at community college. Since I remember this incident quite well, I'm going to use my writing skills to elaborate where my journal was a lot less descriptive. Mainly because, back when I wrote about this, I never expected to tell anyone else about it. Thanks to Raven's awesome channel, these stories of mine can be shared with an audience that loves and appreciates the sharing of crazy true stories. Thank you, Raven, for the awesome family you've created, and I apologize for the length of this journal entry. Thank you for being a part of that family, Fox, and never apologize for the length of your stories. As always, this is a true story. There was a rather nice mall back where I used to live that was rather popular during the 90s and early 2000s, until it made news headlines due to a shooting that broke out in the food court near the mall's movie theater. Without getting into too many details about this incident, just know that several bystanders who had nothing to do with the incident were unfortunately killed, along with one of the suspects who also fired on police officers after a brief standoff. The mall itself was closed for a little while due to an investigation, which ultimately sealed its fate. Even though it did open up again after the investigation into the incident ended. The mall did try everything it could to get back to the once chipper energy and atmosphere it had, but obviously, since this is an Urbex story, you can accurately conclude that the efforts fell short. Eventually, the mall closed, and was left abandoned. And around the time that I was in college, I had gotten into exploring a few abandoned buildings with one of my friends. Even though the story behind what we called Murder Mall was scary enough, my friend Derek, who we affectionately called Captain Crunch, and I always said that, at some point, we would inevitably go explore the huge complex for ourselves. Derek got the nickname Captain Crunch because he was a large, muscular guy who trained at the same martial arts school as me. And he had a habit of breaking small things, like phones, controllers, and buttons. And one time he drank too much at a birthday party and jumped into his coffee table, shattering it instantly, all while proclaiming, "I am Captain Crunch," which his wife did film for proof. Both of us were little kids when the mall was originally open, and would have most likely been in middle school around the time it was officially closed. I don't remember going to the mall, but my parents told me that they had a couple of carnivals in their giant parking lots that we visited as a family when I was a small child. Anyway, we decided to pick a Saturday during the summer of 2013 to finally go and check out the mall, since Derek said that we had waited long enough, and he wanted to do one more exploration before he officially moved out of state. I agreed, of course, and I remember how nervous we both were on the drive up to the mall. Just to clarify, this mall was huge. Like the kind of place you would have to take frequent breaks to make it from one side to the other. Plus, it had an upper level. The entire property was fenced off, however. There were several sections that were fallen in, torn open, or otherwise compromised, and Derek parked his car across the street from it at a gas station. We did a final check on our bags, I usually packed basics, like a med kit, small water flask, headlamp, small toolkit, and a standard lighter. And since we didn't play about our safety, I made sure to have at least a couple of knives on me, as well as an additional one inside the medkit. Derek packed similar things, but he preferred standard book bags to the small, agile, single sling bags that I wear. So we could also include items like a climbing rope, a poncho, and some of his army gear that I didn't recognize at the time. We also began to carry walkie-talkies, which we kept fully charged and on our person, as a recent addition to our gear after we got separated from friends exploring an old aquarium a year or so prior. We ran across the street from the gas station, followed the fence until we found a decent-sized opening, and entered the large parking lot that preceded the massive mall like a looming, ominous front porch. For any fellow Urbex people listening to this story, I'm sure that you can agree, or have at least experienced, what I'm about to say. There's a weird transition when you step from the world of the living, moving, loud, and everyday into a place that's frozen in time, abandoned, and seems more like an alternate universe to the world that you know. We used to call it the distance effect, a minor reference to the feeling of moving away from society as we know it, to a place that seems forgotten by our world. The giant parking lot was like a battlefield between modernization and nature, as trees, towering weeds, and thick, relentless patches of grass burst from the cracks and crevices in what used to be flat, smooth asphalt for a parking lot. And Derek and I were crossing where we could, careful to mind our steps for broken glass, stray roots, or anything that could end our trip too soon. As the mall building grew closer, and I remember writing about this, it felt like the loud, busy world around the mall was silent, and the air was thick, heavy, and stagnant. Murder Mall had several entries, which were located inside department stores on each end, the food court at the main entrance, and the theater at what everyone considered to be the rear of the mall. The theater and the front entrances were known to be blocked off due to the rumors we'd heard prior to our own exploration, but we just happened to be on the side of the mall where an entry was possible. And this is somewhat where I show my age and the age of said mall. We entered through the frames of what were once the glass doors of a Foley's, watching our step as we avoided much of the glass, trash, and miscellaneous content. If you know what a Foley's is, or remember the Red Apple sale, congratulations. People think that we're old. Anyway, even with the sun beaming overhead outside, the inside of the department store was dark, and the scent of old wood, dust, and foul water filled the air. Derek was the first to put on his headlamp and turn it on, followed by me doing the same, along with a pair of black workout gloves that I usually wore to protect my hands in case I had to climb or grab onto something. Foley's was mainly empty, except for a few of the aisles, clothes racks, and other abandoned materials that we passed. And the walls were either damaged or covered with graffiti no matter where we looked. Halfway through the store were two escalators that traveled up to the second floor, both of which were roped off. And I remember looking at the one on the right, which had a bunch of metal chairs piled on it, all the way to the next floor. You couldn't see the next floor from the bottom floor unless you rode the escalator up, and I got chills when I saw it for some reason. Why would there be a bunch of metal chairs clogging up an escalator? Derek and I pressed on, intending to make it to the main mall corridor before it got too late into the day. And we did exit Foley's into one of the main walkways of the mall, which hosted stores on the left and the right, and some of which had security gates closed on them, and others that didn't. Light was coming in through the frosted glass roofing high up as we observed the typical upper and lower walkways that most malls have. craning our necks to see the remnants of storefront signs and businesses that used to be there. We knew that we didn't have time to explore them all, but we did keep mental notes of the place as we walked through the quiet, almost unnaturally still walkway. The center areas of the bottom floors had fountains here and there, which explained the foul water smell, and as we walked we saw where greenery had overtaken portions of the store as well. Some shops still looked fairly stocked, while others looked completely gutted. All of them were alone, abandoned, and forgotten. We reached an area that looked like a main junction between all four main paths of the mall. It was an area with damaged, checkered marble flooring, a few rundown dessert carts, and the live garden centerpiece had been overtaken and overgrown with weeds, and other small trees that seemed to have sprouted from pure opportunity. Derek found one of the old plastic mall directory signs that told us where we were and motioned for me to come over. "Let's go here next, and make this trip interesting," he told me with a grin. He was pointing at the movie theater area, which was where the shootout that sealed the mall's fate occurred. I wanted to decline, but curiosity also burned in me deeply, since there was a chance that we would never get to see this mall again after today. Derek was moving, I didn't have a car, and, well, my parents never actually signed off on me free-running around, or otherwise exploring abandoned buildings, so there was no way I could ask them to drop me off at the local abandoned mall so I could explore. I agreed, and we headed to the junction on the right side of the mall. This is where things began to change about our trip. As we walked, it seemed to get darker, for lack of a better description. It was hot and stuffy, being summertime, but the walkway on the right side of the mall had a cold and chilly feel in the air. It seemed heavier than normal. I heard something behind me when we were passing a large play area for kids, and when I turned to look, I thought that I saw a kid ducking into the ball pit. It threw me off so badly that Derek turned around to ask me if I was okay, and then even went and looked at the ball pit when I told him what I saw. What's scary to me is how much crap they just left in this mall. I mean, there's clothes, shoes, even some of the claw games still have prizes in here, Derek joked, trying to lift my spirit as he walked past me, determined to reach the theater area. I wrote down what he said because I made a note in my journal that for someone who seemed as fearless as Derek, he was showing signs that none of us had ever seen from him before. Signs of being rattled. We pressed on from there, passed by this abandoned car that we assumed was one of the Win Me raffle vehicles you often see in malls. That's when we both began hearing what sounded like someone playing loud music up ahead. Derek and I knew that it was possible that we might run into some homeless people, or even other explorers on our trip, but this was weird to us. The music seemed like it was coming from a loud speaker, and as far as we had seen, there wasn't any power in the mall. So we stopped for a second, and then Derek jogged a few feet ahead to take a look, giving me a hand signal to stay back as he did. Once he was a few yards away, the music stopped abruptly, and the mall went silent again. I ran over to Derek immediately. Before I could say anything, we heard the sound of running feet go past us on the floor above, and we both started scanning the upper walkway with our eyes, trying to figure out what we had just heard. Derek was noticeably bothered, and I was beginning to feel my heart racing as we looked around, trying to figure out what we could do. "It's starting to get interesting," Derek admitted with a chuckle. I gave him a "you don't say" expression, and he shrugged and motioned for me to follow him as he began walking further into the chaos of whatever was going on with this path. The odd occurrences did not stop there. When we passed a gourmet popcorn store, we could smell freshly popped popcorn. despite the store being closed and gated off. We watched a pair of old Nike shoes jump off the shelf when we passed by a Payless shoe store, and no, that's not a typo. The shoes didn't just fall, they quite literally went up from a flat shelving that they had been sitting on and smacked onto the floor when we looked. An old Galaga arcade game flickered on and then died when we passed by the Family Fun Center. And a loud thud that I still to this day cannot explain happened behind us, as if someone dropped what I can best describe as a boulder on the ground behind us. We finally arrived at the infamous food court, and just ahead of us was the movie theater. And when I tell you the energy in that area felt off, it's an understatement. The rest of the mall seemed dead, stale, and mildly creepy, but the area in this food court seemed aware, for a lack of a better term. There were more weird creaks and random noises. We heard what sounded like voices of people shopping in the distance, even some laughter. Derek kept looking over the empty, bolted-down tables of the food court back and forth, as if he was unsure about something. And I remember being afraid to scare him if I spoke suddenly or walked up too briskly. He never told me what he was doing, but to me it looked like he had seen something. He waved his hand backward at me as if to tell me to move back, and I remember my heart began racing once more and the air felt increasingly tense and anxious. "Freeze! Hands up!" an authoritative voice shouted from behind us. We turned and noticed the distinct silhouette of a police officer in uniform, shining what we believed was a flashlight in our faces. There was something off about the brightness of the flashlight, as if it was too dim to be as bright as it was. Because I remember that it didn't seem to illuminate Derek and I, but it was bright enough to keep us from seeing the officer's face. Derek and I instinctively put our hands up as Derek turned to speak to the officer. "We're just exploring, officer. We haven't done anything wrong," he stated. The officer just stood there, his face hidden behind the glow of his flashlight, and he stared at us. I kept my hands up, heart pounding like mad, and Derek seemed a lot more composed than I was, but also seemed confused. The officer moved his right hand to what I assume was his radio on his right shoulder, and I'm using a different name for the sake of the story, but he said something along the lines of, "Dispatch, this is Peterson," into his radio, and then followed up with having 2 potential shoplifting suspects in custody. Derek looked over at me and shook his head and then started backing up slowly. I remember trying to get him to stop moving, but his eyes were now completely wide and filled with fear. "We need to go right now," Derek said, not caring that the officer could hear him. "What are you talking about? We don't need to make this worse," I pleaded with him. Derek stopped walking backwards and put his hands down, looking at me with genuine fear this time. "We need to go. That is not an officer," Derek told me quickly. "What are you talking about?" I whispered back to him, noticing that the officer seemed to be watching us talk, and didn't seem to be approaching or even acknowledging that Derek had put his hands down. Derek let out a sigh, and then looked over at the officer and back at me with remorse. "That's not normal behavior at all. I put my hands down and the officer didn't say anything about it. Plus, dispatch is not responding to him because he's not able to call dispatch. Also, the name that officer gave was Officer Peterson, one of the responders who was killed here years ago during that mall shootout," Derek stated firmly. My whole body went cold. Derek was right. This officer didn't seem to actually be acknowledging or responding to us directly at all. In fact, the officer seemed as if he just came out of nowhere. We didn't see or hear him walk up to us. He just seemed to appear and shout orders. I looked over at Derek, but before he could say anything else, the officer made this growling, laughing sound that seemed to echo off the walls. And then he started running toward us. There was something bone-chilling about him. Each step he took brought heavy waves of fear, and without further hesitation, Derek grabbed my arm and took off running. We ran like crazy down the main walkway of the mall toward the center junction, where we hooked a left back to the main walkway that led to Foley's, where we were able to slip out of the mall completely. We could hear stomping footsteps thundering behind us the entire time, but we didn't dare look behind us to see the officer following us. We didn't stop running until we made it across the parking lot and out of the fence. I remember how quiet it was on the ride back home, and I think it was because we didn't really know what to say to each other about the experience. We had only experienced a tiny portion of the mall, but silently we both began to understand why the mall might have ended up being completely abandoned. We never heard anyone else talk about experiencing any of the things we experienced when we went there, but then again, it wasn't something that a lot of people we knew were into. Most of the lore surrounding what we called Murder Mall was speculation from the actual news stories about the initial shootout. And then the final coverage about it was simply that the mall was closing. There were no obituaries or tributes for the families of the victims and officers who were killed during that incident. But, again, beyond these things, nothing else was ever said about the future of the mall grounds, or any other odd experiences like the one Derek and I had there. However, that doesn't mean that no one else has experienced what we did, or worse. Anyways, that's one of my crazy journal entries from 2013 about another crazy experience in my crazy life.